It began with a town that was never meant to hold, and with men who were told to do it anyway. Bastogne was a road junction, nothing more. A small Belgian town surrounded by forest, snow, and narrow roads that mattered only because everything passed through them. In December of 1944, when the German Ardennes Offensive exploded out of the winter fog, Bastogne suddenly became essential. Whoever controlled it controlled movement. Whoever lost it risked collapse. And into that uncertainty came the 101st Airborne Division. They arrived without preparation, without full equipment, without winter clothing, pulled from rest and refit, rushed forward on freezing trucks. The paratroopers of the 101 were not dropped from the sky this time. They were driven straight into the path of a breakthrough designed to shatter the Allied front. Many barely knew where they were. Fewer still understood how bad it was about to become. Within days, they were surrounded. German forces closed in from every direction. Roads were cut. Artillery fell constantly. Snow filled foxholes faster than they could be dug. Ammunition ran low. Food ran lower. Medical supplies became precious beyond measure. And still, the perimeter held. Bastogne became a circle of resistance. Every approach was defended. Every village fought over. Every night brought renewed pressure. The cold was relentless. Weapons froze, fingers numbed. Wounded men waited in barns and cellars without heat, without enough bandages, without certainty they would survive the night. Air resupply was impossible while the weather remained sealed shut. The sky itself felt like part of the siege. German demands for surrender came with confidence. The reply came with defiance. A single word carried through history. Not shouted, not theatrical, but firm enough to echo far beyond the forest. It was not bravado. It was refusal. Refusal to yield ground. Refusal to abandon each other. Refusal to let momentum decide their fate. Inside Bastogne, the fight was intimate and exhausting. Patrols clashed in the woods. Artillery shattered buildings already half ruined. Positions changed hands and were taken back again. The paratroopers fought not as isolated heroes, but as a community under siege. Officers, enlisted men, medics, cooks, drivers, all pulled into the same struggle. Rank mattered less than resolve. Survival depended on everyone. Outside the perimeter, relief was racing north, but inside, the 101 did not know when or if help would arrive. They held anyway, because holding was the mission, because retreat was impossible, because surrender meant more than defeat. It meant abandonment of everything they believed they represented. When the skies finally cleared, supply drops fell into the snow. Ammunition, food, bandages. Proof that they had not been forgotten. Days later, armored forces broke through, cracking the encirclement and restoring contact with the outside world. Bastogne did not fall, and because it did not, the German offensive never recovered. The stand of the 101 mattered not because it was perfect, but because it was necessary. It bought time. It shattered timetables. It turned momentum into delay. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne became a symbol, not of invincibility, but of endurance under impossible conditions, of what happens when soldiers are asked to hold without certainty, without comfort, and without any guarantee that help is coming. Tonight, we return to that frozen perimeter, to the snow-covered woods and shattered buildings, to the moment when holding a town meant holding the line for an entire army, to Bastogne and the paratroopers who refused to let it go. And before we continue, if you're still here, listening all the way through, if these long, quiet journeys into history help you slow down, reflect, or feel grounded after a long day, then I hope you'll consider subscribing. When you subscribe, you're not just supporting a channel, you're helping keep this calm, immersive style of storytelling alive. If this space gives you perspective, comfort, or simply somewhere steady to rest your thoughts, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the story of the 101 at Bastogne, December 18th, 1944. A colonel sits in a windowless room at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, staring at a wall map of Western Europe. He's been awake for 36 hours, and the red grease pencil in his hand is shaking. Not from exhaustion, from fear. 2 days ago, this map showed a clean, continuous Allied line stretching from Switzerland to the North Sea. Now, it looks like someone took a knife and slashed through the center. German arrows are racing west, deeper into Belgium with each passing hour, and the colonel has been given a simple task that's proving impossible: find the 101st Airborne Division. They exist, of course, 11,000 paratroopers and glider infantry, some of the most elite soldiers America has produced. The problem is that nobody seems to know where they are. The last report placed them in Mourmelon-le-Grand, a town in eastern France, supposedly resting after 2 months of continuous combat. But when headquarters tried to reach them by radio this morning, there was no response. When they tried by telephone, the lines were dead. When they sent a courier, he returned 6 hours later saying he'd found empty barracks, abandoned equipment, and a few drunk soldiers who had no idea where their units went. The 101st Airborne had vanished at the exact moment America needed them most. What the colonel doesn't know, what nobody at Supreme Headquarters knows yet, is that 60 miles northeast, something unprecedented is happening in the frozen hills of Belgium. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, 2 days earlier, the largest German artillery barrage since 1940 began falling on American positions along an 85-mile front. In the dense forests of the Ardennes, where American commanders had placed their weakest divisions because they believed the terrain was impassable to tanks, 200,000 German troops and 1,000 panzers were pouring through gaps in the line. Within 12 hours, entire American regiments had ceased to exist. Within 24 hours, German spearheads had advanced 15 miles. The goal, intercepted Allied intelligence would later reveal, was audacious to the point of madness: race 120 miles to Antwerp, split the Allied armies in two, capture the port that supplied 90% of Allied logistics, and force America and Britain to negotiate a separate peace in the West. The architects of this plan, Adolf Hitler and his most loyal generals, had bet everything on surprise, speed, and weather. They achieved all three. American intelligence had dismissed the possibility of a major German offensive, believing Hitler's armies were too weak, too depleted, too demoralized to attempt anything more than local counterattacks. The speed of the advance caught entire divisions in their sleep. Some American soldiers died in their bunks, never firing a shot. And the weather. The weather was Hitler's gift. A thick blanket of fog and low clouds had settled over Belgium and Luxembourg, grounding the Allied air forces that had dominated European skies for 18 months. For the first time since D-Day, American soldiers would have to fight without the comforting thunder of P-47 Thunderbolts overhead, without the reassurance that German tanks could be obliterated from above before they ever reached American lines. At Supreme Headquarters, the crisis meeting on December 18th brought together every senior Allied commander in Europe. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, studied the map with an expression that betrayed nothing, though everyone in the room knew the stakes. If the Germans reached the Meuse River, and they were now only 30 miles away, the entire Allied position in Europe could collapse. Two armies, the 1st and the 9th, would be cut off north of the German penetration. British forces would have to retreat to defend the Channel ports. The Americans would lose 6 months of gains in a single week. Eisenhower made his decision with characteristic clarity: throw everything available into the breach, seal the shoulders of the German penetration, and find strong points where American forces could hold while reinforcements arrived. That's when someone pointed to a small dot on the map, a crossroads town in southern Belgium that most of the officers had never heard of: Bastogne, population 4,000. 7 major roads converged there like spokes on a wheel. The military logic was simple: control Bastogne, control the roads. Control the roads, control which direction hundreds of thousands of troops and thousands of tanks could move. The terrain around Bastogne, rolling hills, thick forests, narrow lanes, meant that mechanized armies needed paved highways. Every major east-west route in southern Belgium passed through this single town. If the Germans took it, their supply convoys could move freely. If the Americans held it, every German tank racing toward Antwerp would be operating at the end of a logistical chain stretched to breaking. Eisenhower turned to his staff and asked which units could reach Bastogne first. The The answer that came back was the one that had led to that colonel's 36-hour shift. The 101st Airborne Division, if anyone could find them. What nobody in that headquarters knew was that the 101st had found themselves. On December 17th, as American units across the Ardennes retreated in chaos, General Anthony McAuliffe, temporary commander of the division because his superior was on leave in the United States, had received fragmentary orders to prepare for movement. Prepare for what? To where? For how long? Nobody could tell him. The division had been devastated in Operation Market Garden 3 months earlier, the failed attempt to capture a bridge at Arnhem in the Netherlands. They had suffered 3,400 casualties, nearly a quarter of their strength. The survivors had been promised a month of rest, time to integrate replacement soldiers, time to repair equipment, time to sleep without the sound of artillery. They'd gotten 11 days. Most soldiers in Mourmelon-le-Grand on December 17th were playing football, drinking in cafes, or traveling on passes to Paris. Their winter uniforms hadn't arrived. Their ammunition hadn't been fully restocked. Some units were at 60% strength. It didn't matter. At 8 o'clock that evening, McAuliffe received his destination. Bastogne, 107 miles north through freezing rain. Arrival time, critical. Mission details to follow. Within 2 hours, 380 trucks began rolling out of Mourmelon-le-Grand in a convoy that stretched for miles. The soldiers climbing into the open trucks wore summer combat fatigues because their winter gear was still in supply depots. Many had no helmets. Some had no ammunition beyond what was in their rifle clips. They had no maps of Belgium, no intelligence on German positions, no understanding of what they were driving toward. What they did understand, very quickly, was that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The convoy moving north passed an endless stream of American vehicles heading south, not in orderly withdrawal, but in panicked flight. Trucks piled with wounded soldiers, tanks towing disabled tanks, jeeps carrying only officers and their personal gear, abandoning their units. And between the military vehicles, thousands of Belgian civilians clogging the roads with carts, wagons, bicycles, and wheelbarrows carrying everything they owned. The soldiers of the 101st didn't need intelligence briefings to understand the truth. They weren't reinforcing a defensive line. They were being thrown into a gap where no line existed. They were going to Bastogne not because it was well defended, but because it was barely defended at all. And every mile north, as the convoy passed more retreating Americans, as they saw the terror in civilian faces, as they heard distant artillery growing louder, they understood something else. They weren't being sent to fight alongside other divisions. They were being sent to fight alone. The 101st Airborne Division, understrength and undersupplied, was about to become the only thing standing between Hitler's panzers and a road network that could change the outcome of the entire war. They reached Bastogne on the morning of December 19th, and by that evening, the last roads into town would be cut. The siege was about to begin. December 19th, 1944, 2 o'clock in the morning. Private first class. James Simmons sits in the back of an open truck somewhere in Belgium, so cold he's stopped shivering. That's when he knows he's in real trouble, when the body gives up trying to warm itself. Around him, 30 other soldiers from the 101st Parachute Infantry Regiment huddle against the canvas sides, trying to block the wind that's been cutting through their summer uniforms for 6 hours. Nobody's talking anymore. They talked for the first 2 hours, jokes and complaints and speculation about where they were going. They stopped talking when the convoy started passing the refugees. Simmons will remember specific faces for the rest of his life. An old woman pushing a baby carriage filled with photograph albums. A priest carrying nothing but a crucifix, walking barefoot in the snow. A family of 6 sharing a single horse, the children riding while the parents stumbled alongside. But what disturbs him most is their eyes. These people look at the American convoy moving north with something between pity and horror, as if the Americans are heading towards certain death and simply don't know it yet. Around midnight, they'd started passing American units retreating south. Not withdrawing, retreating. There's a difference. A withdrawal is organized, controlled, officers maintaining formation and discipline. What Simmons sees is chaos. trucks racing south at dangerous speeds, men clinging to the sides without weapons or helmets, entire units dissolved into masses of individuals thinking only of escape. At one point, their convoy had stopped to let a column of Sherman tanks pass heading south, and Simmons heard his sergeant yelling at the tank commander, "Where the hell are you going? We're moving north." The tank commander, a captain with a bandage around his head, had looked down from his turret with an expression Simmons had never seen on an American officer's face before. Not anger, not fear, but something worse, resignation. "You're heading the wrong way," the captain had shouted over his engine noise. "Germans are everywhere up there. They've got more tanks than we've ever seen. Turn around while you can." Then his tank lurched forward and disappeared into the darkness, leaving the convoy of the 101st sitting in the road. They didn't turn around. The trucks restarted their engines and continued north, toward whatever had broken that captain's nerve. Dawn on December 19th reveals a landscape transformed by war. The pristine Belgian countryside that American soldiers liberated 3 months ago, the neat farms, the undamaged villages, the locals waving American flags, it has become a corridor of destruction. Buildings burn in every direction. Craters from artillery shells turn roads into obstacle courses. And everywhere, abandoned equipment. Jeeps flipped into ditches, supply trucks still idling with their doors hanging open, field hospitals evacuated so rapidly that medical supplies litter the roadside. This is what defeat looks like, Simmons realizes. Not the glorious last stands shown in training films, but wholesale collapse, armies dissolving into atoms of terrified men running for their lives. The 101st is driving through the debris of America's worst defeat since Pearl Harbor, and they're driving toward its source. They reach Bastogne at 10 o'clock in the morning. The town is nearly deserted. Stone buildings that housed 4,000 Belgian civilians 3 days ago now echo with emptiness. Shop windows are shattered. Front doors swing open in the wind. The population has fled, and the American units that were supposed to defend this place have fled with them. The 101st dismounts from their trucks in the town square and receives their first detailed orders. Establish a defensive perimeter around Bastogne. The problem, immediately apparent, is that nobody knows where that perimeter should be, because nobody knows where the Germans are. Staff officers spread maps on the hoods of jeeps and argue about which villages to defend. But the maps are useless. The front lines marked on them are 3 days out of date. And in 3 days, the entire situation has been revolutionized. General McAuliffe, commanding from a stone barracks that still has power and phone lines, makes a series of rapid-fire decisions that will define everything that follows. He sends reconnaissance patrols racing outward on all the roads leading from Bastogne, with orders to advance until they make contact with German forces, then report back immediately. He splits his division into regimental combat teams, assigning each a sector to defend even though he doesn't yet know what they're defending against. He establishes his command post in the basement of the Heinz Barracks, a Belgian army installation that offers thick walls and underground spaces for wounded, and he sends urgent messages to Corps headquarters asking for clarification. What's our mission here? Are we defending until reinforcements arrive, or are we the reinforcements? How long do we need to hold? The responses that trickle back are worse than no information at all. Contradictory, fragmentary, clearly sent by headquarters that doesn't understand the situation any better than he does. By afternoon, the reconnaissance patrols start returning with news that transforms confusion into crisis. The Germans aren't just approaching Bastogne, they're already in the villages 5 miles to the east. American patrols sent to occupy towns named Noville, Warden, and Bizori encounter German infantry who've been there since yesterday. Firefights erupt in farm fields and forest paths as Americans try to push forward and Germans try to push west. Casualties begin flowing back to Bastogne. Men shot, men with shrapnel wounds, men whose vehicles hit mines on roads that were safe 24 hours ago. McAuliffe realizes he's not preparing a defense. He's already in the middle of one. The battle has begun whether he's ready or not, and he's definitely not ready. His artillery hasn't arrived yet. Those slower-moving battalions are still somewhere on the roads from France. His medical supplies are minimal. His ammunition stocks are whatever the trucks carried, which was loaded in desperate haste back in Mourmelon-le-Grand, without any clear sense of how long they'd need to fight. December 19th, evening. Colonel Ewell's 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment makes first major contact with German forces on the eastern edge of the hastily forming perimeter. A full-scale firefight erupts in failing light as American paratroopers, many of whom arrived in Bastogne less than 8 hours ago, meet German infantry advancing from the village of Neff. The sound of gunfire echoes across the frozen fields, and soldiers throughout Bastogne realize what the officers have been hesitant to say out loud. They're not reinforcing a defensive line, they are the defensive line. Nothing stands between the German advance and this road network except 11,000 exhausted Americans who were supposed to be resting in France. The situation crystallizes with terrible clarity. The trucks that brought them here have already turned around, heading back south to ferry more troops or supplies, or simply to escape before the roads are cut. Bastogne is an island now. Surrounded by water they can't see but can feel rising. That night, as soldiers dig foxholes in frozen ground that fights every strike of their entrenching tools, as artillery units finally arrive and begin setting up firing positions by flashlight, as medical officers inventory supplies that everyone knows won't last a week, Private Simmons stands guard on the eastern perimeter and looks out into darkness. Somewhere out there, maybe a mile away, maybe less, German armies are moving. He can hear their vehicles, the distinctive sound of diesel engines that marks German tanks. He can see distant fires where villages burn. And he understands, with the clarity that comes from exhaustion and cold and fear, that morning will bring the real test. Tonight they race to reach Bastogne before the Germans. Tomorrow they'll discover whether reaching it first means anything at all, or whether they've just arrived in time to be trapped. The race to nowhere is over. The race to survive is about to begin. December 20th, 1944, 5 o'clock in the morning. General Anthony McAuliffe stands in the basement of Heinz Barracks, studying a map by the light of a kerosene lantern. He's been commanding the 101st Airborne Division for exactly 3 days, since his superior, General Maxwell Taylor, departed for a conference in the United States on December 17th. In peacetime, McAuliffe would be considered a placeholder, a temporary commander keeping the seat warm until the real general returned. But there's nothing temporary about the situation he faces now. The map spread before him shows Bastogne at the center, and around it, in a rough circle, the positions his units occupy. It's not really a defensive perimeter yet. It's more like a collection of dots, each representing an American unit that's holding a village or crossroads or woodline because someone told them to dig in there. McAuliffe's task this morning is to connect those dots into something resembling a coherent defense before the Germans realize how weak and improvised the American position truly is. The problem reveals itself immediately. McAuliffe has approximately 18,000 men under his command, a number that sounds substantial until you try to draw a defensive circle around a town where 7 major roads converge. Basic infantry doctrine states that a division defends a front of roughly 5 miles. The perimeter McAuliffe needs to establish measures 16 miles in circumference. This is a mathematical impossibility, and every officer crowded into this basement knows it. To defend 16 miles properly, he'd need 3 divisions, perhaps 50,000 men. What he has instead is an understrength Airborne Division, some armored units that arrived with the 101st Engineer Battalion's artillery crews, and what he calls the bastard units, fragments of other divisions that got caught up in the chaos and somehow ended up in Bastogne. He has tank destroyers without tanks to destroy yet. He has anti-aircraft batteries that can't shoot at planes because the fog is too thick. He has medics without enough bandages and supply officers without enough supplies to distribute. This is what he has to work with, and this is what he has to make work. McAuliffe begins issuing orders with a precision that belies the desperation of the situation. The 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment will hold the eastern sector, where German contact was heaviest yesterday. The 506th will take the northern approaches. The 327th Glider Infantry, men who consider themselves the poor cousins of the paratroopers because they arrived by glider rather than parachute, gets the southern and eastern sectors. Team Cherry and Team Desabris, ad hoc armored combat teams built around tank companies and armored infantry, will plug the gaps. Artillery battalions position themselves in the center, where they can range the entire perimeter. Every unit gets a sector, every sector gets a commander, every commander gets orders to hold regardless of odds. It's the kind of defensive plan that would earn a failing grade at Command and Staff College because it violates every principle of concentration of force. McAuliffe is spreading his strength so thin that a determined attack at any single point should break through. But concentration requires having something to concentrate, and he doesn't. The choice is between a thin defense everywhere or a strong defense nowhere. He chooses thin. By midday, American soldiers throughout the perimeter are discovering just how thin. Sergeant Paul Giles of the 327th Glider Infantry finds himself responsible for defending a stretch of road that, according to doctrine, should be held by an entire company of 180 men. He has 32. His orders are to prevent German forces from using this road to advance on Bastogne. How he's supposed to accomplish this with 32 men and 2 machine guns against an enemy that might show up with tanks. Nobody tells him that part. He begins by sending 2 men forward as observers, positioning them in a farmhouse 400 yards ahead, where they can watch the approach road. Then he spaces his remaining 30 men along a wood line, leaving 50-yard gaps between positions that any trained infantry could simply walk through. Every man gets a sector of fire. Every sector overlaps slightly with the next. And Giles knows from long experience that these overlapping fields of fire will work beautifully on a practice range and will fall apart the moment actual German soldiers arrive with artillery and grenades and the simple courage to keep advancing despite losses. The bigger problem is the ground itself. Belgium in December is frozen solid, the soil hard as concrete after days of temperatures in the teens. The entrenching tools that work fine in summer dirt bounce off winter earth with impacts that jar men's wrists and accomplish nothing. Soldiers learn to identify any spot where snow has drifted deeper. That means the ground beneath might be slightly softer. They use picks and axes scrounged from Belgian farms. They build up parapets with logs and stones instead of digging down. The result is foxholes that would more accurately be called shallow scrapes. Depressions in the earth 18 inches deep that offer psychological comfort and almost no actual protection. A man lying in one of these scrapes is protected from small arms fire that comes in flat and low. He's completely vulnerable to anything that explodes above him or lands nearby. And everything in modern war, mortars, artillery, grenades, rockets, explodes above or nearby. The soldiers know this. They dig anyway, because digging is what soldiers do when they're told to defend ground, even when the ground won't cooperate. By evening, something resembling a perimeter exists. If you stood above Bastogne and looked down, which would be suicidal given the German artillery starting to probe the area, you'd see a rough oval of American positions, maybe 4 miles from north to south, maybe 5 miles from east to west. At certain points, the line is continuous, foxholes spaced close enough that defenders can support each other. At other points, there are gaps of hundreds of yards, places where a German patrol could simply walk through the perimeter if they knew where to look. McAuliffe knows about these gaps. He has reserve platoons ready to rush to any point that comes under attack. But reserve platoons is a generous description for what amounts to clerks, drivers, and cooks who've been given rifles and told to wait for orders. The defense of Bastogne rests on 2 assumptions. First, that the Germans don't know how weak it is. Second, that American artillery will be good enough to cover the places American infantry can't reach. The artillery begins arriving throughout the day. 4 battalions of 105mm howitzers, 12 guns per battalion, 48 guns total. This is the entire artillery complement of an airborne division, and it's woefully inadequate for the mission. In a normal defensive situation, division artillery is supplemented by corps artillery, heavier guns, more ammunition, longer range. But 8th Corps, the organization that's supposed to be coordinating this defense, fled Bastogne on December 19th when it became clear German forces were closing in. The Corps commander, his staff, all their communication equipment, all their supplies, gone south, leaving the 101st to fight alone. So 48 guns will have to do. The artillery officers begin a frantic process of surveying positions, calculating range tables, and setting up firing coordinates for every conceivable target around the perimeter. They work through the night because they know tomorrow will bring the test. Tomorrow the Germans will discover Americans are here in force, and tomorrow they'll do something about it. December 21st, dawn. The perimeter is as complete as it's going to get. Soldiers shiver in inadequate foxholes, staring out at frozen fields and distant tree lines where they know Germans are gathering. Officers walk the lines, checking positions, offering encouragement that rings hollow because everyone understands the mathematics. 18,000 Americans in a circle 16 miles around, facing German forces estimated at division strength on every side. At minimum 40,000 enemy soldiers, probably more. The defenders are outnumbered at least 2-1 overall, and at any point the Germans choose to attack, they'll have local superiority of 5 or 10-1. Traditional military wisdom states that attackers need 3-1 advantage to overcome prepared defenses. The Germans have that and more. Every calculation says the Americans shouldn't be able to hold, but McAuliffe isn't fighting on paper. He's fighting with the stubborn determination of soldiers who drove 107 miles through a blizzard to get here and aren't about to surrender a town they just reached. The circle has been drawn. Now they'll discover if it's strong enough to hold. That afternoon brings the first major German probe of the defenses. A battalion-strength attack on Noville, a village 2 miles north of Bastogne that Team des Aubry has been ordered to hold. The attack begins with artillery, German 105mm guns firing from concealed positions in the woods. Then comes infantry, advancing in company formations across open fields. And behind the infantry, the sound every American soldier has been dreading: tanks, the distinctive growl of German panzers, moving forward to exploit whatever breakthrough the infantry achieves. Team des Aubry, barely 400 men with a handful of Sherman tanks and tank destroyers, holds through the afternoon. They hold by calling down American artillery, by fighting from prepared positions in stone buildings, by destroying lead German tanks and forcing the others to retreat. They hold, but they take casualties. 30 men killed, 60 wounded, 2 tanks destroyed, and everyone knows this was just a probe, the Germans testing the defenses to find weak points. The real attack will come when they've found them. McAuliffe receives the casualty reports that evening and makes a notation in his log that reveals everything about his mindset. Situation normal, he writes, which is Army shorthand that every soldier in Bastogne would immediately recognize as profane. Situation normal, all fouled up. The perimeter that shouldn't exist is holding against attacks that should have broken it. Nothing about this is normal, and everyone knows it. But McAuliffe's notation accomplishes something important. It treats the impossible as routine, the desperate as ordinary, the potentially catastrophic as just another day at war. His soldiers will need that attitude in the hours ahead, because December 21st is about to become December 22nd, and December 22nd will bring news that transforms everything. The Germans are about to close the last road into Bastogne. The siege won't be theoretical anymore. It will be absolute. The circle isn't just drawn, it's about to become a cage. December 18th, 1944, 400 miles east of Bastogne. Adolf Hitler stands before a wall-sized map in his headquarters at Ziegenberg near Frankfurt, studying the same Belgian road network that's causing so much confusion at Allied Supreme Headquarters. But Hitler sees no confusion here. He sees clarity. 7 roads converge at Bastogne, like arteries leading to a heart, and he needs that heart-pumping German supplies west, or his entire offensive will bleed out before reaching the Meuse River. The plan he's studying, officially named Operation Wacht am Rhein, unofficially known as the Ardennes Offensive, represents Germany's last strategic reserve, the final gamble of a regime that's been in retreat for 18 months. Since D-Day, German armies have been pushed out of France, pushed out of Belgium, pushed to the edge of Germany itself. The Russians are closing from the east. The British and Americans are building up forces for a spring offensive. Hitler's generals have told him the war is lost. This offensive is his answer to them. The strategic logic, explained to skeptical field marshals over the past 6 weeks, is aggressive and potentially decisive. The Allies have become overextended, their supply lines stretched from Normandy beaches to the German border. The port of Antwerp, captured by British forces in September, handles 90% of Allied logistics: fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, reinforcements. Everything flows through Antwerp. Hitler's plan calls for German armies to punch through the weak American sector in the Ardennes, race 120 miles to the Meuse River, cross it, and drive another 40 miles to Antwerp. Along the way, they'll split the Allied forces in two, trapping the British Second Army and the American Ninth Army north of the penetration. With a quarter of Allied combat power cut off and the main supply port in German hands, the British and Americans will be forced to negotiate. That's the theory. Whether it can work depends entirely on speed, getting to Antwerp before the Allies can react. And speed depends on roads. This is where Bastogne enters Hitler's calculations. The Ardennes terrain that makes it impassable to tanks in American estimation makes it absolutely dependent on paved highways in German experience. The region is a nightmare of steep hills, dense forests, and narrow streams that become impassable mud traps when weather turns bad. Mechanized armies built around tanks, armored personnel carriers, self-propelled guns, and truck-borne supplies cannot operate cross-country here. They need roads. The German offensive plan commits 2 panzer armies to the operation, roughly 1,000 tanks, and every one of those tanks burns fuel at rates that require constant resupply. The supply trucks bringing that fuel are even more road-dependent than the tanks. And in southern Belgium, all the good roads, the paved all-weather highways that can handle heavy traffic, go through Bastogne. Hitler's finger traces these roads on his map. Route Nationale 15, connecting to Liège. Route Nationale 4, leading to Brussels. Route Nationale 85, heading to Namur. Control Bastogne, control the roads. Control the roads. Control which direction a mechanized army can move. The German 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, receives specific orders regarding Bastogne. Capture it quickly, by coup de main if possible, by assault if necessary, but capture it by December 20th at the latest. Manteuffel assigns this task to X-Elfsieber Panzer Corps, which will advance on Bastogne from the northeast, while other corps push west on the northern route. The plan assumes minimal American resistance. Intelligence reports indicate only a single engineer battalion in Bastogne itself, part of 8th Corps, which the Germans correctly assess as understrength and demoralized. Capture Bastogne in a rapid strike, the plan states, then use it as a logistics hub to supply the advanced divisions racing toward the Meuse. The entire offensive timetable depends on this assumption. Lead panzer divisions carry 3 days of fuel. They expect to capture American fuel dumps as they advance. This is literally part of the plan because Germany doesn't have enough fuel to supply the offensive entirely from its own resources. But even with captured American fuel, the tanks need those supplies to reach them. And supplies can't reach racing panzer divisions if supply trucks are stuck on muddy forest tracks because they can't use the paved roads that run through American-held Bastogne. December 19th brings the first deviation from Hitler's perfect plan. German advance units approaching Bastogne from the east encounter American resistance that shouldn't exist. Not a single engineer battalion, substantial infantry forces, well-armed, occupying defensive positions. Ex-Elfsieber Panzer Corps commander, General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, makes a tactical decision that will haunt the German offensive. He orders the 2nd Panzer Division to bypass Bastogne and continue west. Speed is essential, Hitler's orders have emphasized. Don't get bogged down, reducing every American strongpoint. So 2nd Panzer races past Bastogne to the north, leaving the Panzerlehr Division and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division to deal with the American defenders. Von Luttwitz estimates this will take 1 day, perhaps 2. He's wrong, but he won't discover that until his lead panzer divisions are 50 miles west of Bastogne, running on fumes, waiting for supply convoys that never arrive. By December 20th, the German situation around Bastogne is evolving from tactical problem to strategic crisis. Multiple reconnaissance patrols have confirmed that American strength in the town is far greater than intelligence predicted. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division attempts to assault from the north and gets bloodied by American artillery. Panzer Lehr tries to probe from the east and encounters dug-in paratroopers who don't retreat when tanks approach. Von Lüttwitz requests reinforcements. If Bastogne is this strongly held, he needs more than 2 divisions to take it, but reinforcements mean pulling units from the main advance, and that's exactly what the offensive plan is supposed to avoid. The Germans face a dilemma that will define their entire operation. Commit forces to taking Bastogne and slow the drive west, or bypass it and accept that their supply situation will become critical. They try to split the difference, committing enough forces to surround Bastogne, but not enough to capture it quickly, and this compromise satisfies no one. December the 21st, evening. German commanders receive reports that make the Bastogne situation even more urgent. 2nd Panzer Division, racing west, has covered 60 miles but is now reporting fuel shortages. The division's tanks are carrying supplies for 3 days of combat. They've been in combat for 6 days. They were supposed to have captured American fuel dumps. They captured some, but not nearly enough. The supply convoys that should be bringing fuel forward are stuck on secondary roads because the main highway, the good, paved, all-weather road, runs through Bastogne and is controlled by Americans. Similar reports come from other lead divisions. Fuel trucks are having mechanical failures on the rough forest tracks. Traffic jams are backing up for miles where narrow roads force convoys to move single file. What should be a 4-hour drive from German supply dumps to forward positions is taking 12 hours, sometimes 16. The German offensive, conceived as a lightning thrust to the sea, is grinding down to a crawl, and at the center of this crisis, like a stone in a stream diverting water, sits Bastogne. Hitler's reaction, when informed of the Bastogne situation, is predictable and disastrous. He orders von Lüttwitz to capture the town at any cost. No more bypassing, no more economy of force. Commit whatever divisions are necessary to reduce this American strongpoint, because without Bastogne, the offensive cannot succeed. Von Lüttwitz begins pulling units from his advance formations, redirecting them back toward this Belgian crossroads town that was supposed to fall in a day. The 2nd Panzer Division continues west, increasingly isolated. The Panzer Lehr Division turns back toward Bastogne. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division prepares for a major assault, and new units start flowing in. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, elements of the Führer-Begleit Brigade. By December 23rd, 5 German divisions, approximately 45,000 troops, will be focused on capturing a town held by 18,000 Americans. The numbers favor Germany, but the calendar does not. Every day spent fighting for Bastogne is a day the lead panzer divisions sit immobile, burning fuel just to keep their engines warm, waiting for supplies that can't reach them because the road is blocked. The most painful irony is that Hitler's plan assumes speed, and speed requires ignoring strong points like Bastogne. But Bastogne cannot be ignored because it controls the only roads capable of handling the logistics required for speed. The German offensive has been caught in a logical trap of its own making: move fast and starve, or fight for supplies and move slowly. Either way, the timetable is collapsing. Either way, the chances of reaching Antwerp before Allied reinforcements arrive are diminishing. And none of this would matter if Bastogne had fallen on December 20th as planned. But Bastogne didn't fall. Bastogne is holding. And with every hour it holds, Hitler's last great gamble becomes less a lightning strike and more a death spiral. The town Hitler needed is becoming the town that destroys him. The Americans in those frozen foxholes don't know any of this yet, but they will. Because starting December 22nd, the Germans will throw everything they have at breaking the American defense, and the soldiers of the 101st Airborne will learn what it means when an entire army needs you dead. December 21st, 1944, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Captain James Gibney sits in a freezing stone warehouse in Bastogne, counting. Not enemy soldiers. That count changes too rapidly to matter. Not friendly casualties, though those numbers are climbing with disturbing speed. Gibney is counting artillery shells, and the arithmetic he's performing will determine whether the men defending this town live or die. His inventory shows 3,000 rounds of 105mm ammunition currently stored in Bastogne's dumps. That sounds substantial until you understand how quickly modern war consumes ammunition. Yesterday, December 20th, the 4 artillery battalions defending Bastogne fired approximately 1,000 rounds responding to German attacks. At that rate of consumption, they have ammunition for 3 more days. But yesterday wasn't a major assault, just probing attacks and counter-battery fire. When the Germans come into force, and intelligence suggests that will happen very soon, ammunition consumption will double or triple, which means the defenders might have 36 hours of fighting before the guns fall silent. The problem is mathematical and absolute. An artillery battalion in defensive operations typically fires 250 rounds per day at normal rates. But there's nothing normal about being surrounded. Bastogne's artillery is performing missions that would usually be handled by multiple divisions, suppressing German artillery, breaking up infantry assaults, destroying tank formations, providing harassing fire on assembly areas, delivering pre-planned fires on likely attack routes. The 105th Howitzer Battalion alone fired 300 rounds yesterday, a 20% increase over doctrinal rates, and they were being conservative, taking only the highest priority fire missions. Captain Gibney does the math. 4 battalions at 300 rounds per day equals 1,200 rounds daily consumption. Current stock of 3,000 rounds equals 2.5 days of ammunition. After that, the artillery falls silent, and infantry defending a 16-mile perimeter without artillery support might as well be fighting with clubs. The medical situation is even more dire. Major Douglas Davidson, division surgeon, conducts his own inventory in the basement of an old school building that's been converted to a field hospital. His count reveals morphine sufficient for 200 wounded soldiers. The problem is that he's already treating 350 casualties from the fighting on December 19th and 20th, and men keep arriving. Davidson understands combat trauma better than most. He's been with the 101st since Normandy, treated wounds from Utah Beach, from Operation Market Garden, from a dozen small battles that barely made the history books. He knows the patterns. In static defensive fighting, a surrounded division of 18,000 men can expect to lose roughly 1% daily to all causes: killed, wounded, captured, missing. That's 180 men per day. Half of those, the 90 wounded, will require medical treatment. In the week since arriving in Bastogne, Davidson has already treated nearly 400 casualties. His morphine will run out by December 24th. After that, he'll be performing surgery on wounded men who are fully conscious, feeling everything. The food situation borders on absurd. Quartermaster officers report 6 days of K rations remaining in Bastogne's supply dumps. K rations, the small cardboard boxes containing crackers, tinned meat, and cigarettes that keep American soldiers functional, provide 2,100 calories per day. This is adequate for soldiers in garrison or light duty. It's grossly insufficient for men fighting in below freezing temperatures while digging frozen ground and carrying heavy loads. Combat soldiers in winter conditions require 3,500 to 4,000 calories daily just to maintain body weight and functionality. The defenders are already operating at a 600-calorie deficit, and it's starting to show. Soldiers report dizziness, weakness, difficulty concentrating. These aren't psychological symptoms. These are bodies beginning to consume their own muscle mass for energy. By Christmas, men will be so weak that they'll struggle to move wounded comrades or carry ammunition boxes. By New Year's, they'll become bad and ineffective from malnutrition, regardless of ammunition and stocks or German pressure. December 22nd brings the final element to complete Bastogne's isolation. German forces close the last road into town, completing the encirclement. The moment this happens, the siege transforms from theoretical to absolute. No supply trucks will enter Bastogne. No ammunition convoys will arrive. No medical supply runs will reach Davidson's hospital. No food shipments will replenish the quartermaster's stocks. Every shell fired, every bandage used, every meal eaten brings the defenders closer to a point where they can no longer fight even if they want to. General McAuliffe receives the encirclement report with characteristic understatement. Situation fluid, he tells his staff, which is Army speak for, we're completely surrounded and I have no idea what happens next. The psychological impact of encirclement is immediate and subtle. Soldiers who've been fighting confidently for 3 days suddenly confront the reality that they're alone. No one is coming to help. No replacements will arrive if their units take heavy casualties. The ammunition they have is all the ammunition they'll get. This knowledge changes how men fight. Artillery forward observers become far more selective about calling fire missions, knowing every shell is precious. Infantry soldiers switch rifles to semi-automatic instead of full automatic, conserving ammunition. Machine gunners practice firing short, controlled bursts instead of the sustained fire that would normally suppress enemy positions. Every action becomes about conservation, about stretching finite resources across infinite time, because no one knows how long they'll need to hold. The planned relief, everyone has heard rumors of Patton's Third Army fighting north, might arrive in 3 days or 3 weeks. Until then, they fight with what they have, and what they have is diminishing by the hour. The artillery officers respond to the ammunition crisis with innovation born of desperation. They develop a system called TOT, Time on Target, where all 4 battalions calculate firing solutions for a single target and launch shells timed to arrive simultaneously. A traditional artillery mission might fire 50 shells at a target over several minutes. A TOT mission fires 16 shells, 4 from each battalion, that all arrive within a 3-second window. The effect is devastating. Instead of giving enemies time to take cover between shells, TOT missions deliver concentrated explosions that obliterate targets before defenders can react. This technique uses far less ammunition to achieve better results, but it requires extraordinary coordination. Fire direction centers calculate trajectories down to the second. Gun crews practice rapid-fire sequences. Forward observers learn to call TOT missions only when targets absolutely justify the effort. It works, but it's exhausting, demanding constant mental calculation when everyone is already exhausted, cold, and hungry. Medical staff develop their own desperate innovations. Major Davidson begins performing walking wounded triage. Soldiers with injuries that would normally mean evacuation get bandaged and sent back to their units if they can still hold a rifle. A broken arm, splint it and return to duty. Shrapnel wounds in the legs, dig out the fragments, bandage the wound, send the man back. Only the most severe casualties, men who physically cannot fight, get to stay in the hospital, and even they are often lying on bare floors because there aren't enough beds. Davidson's staff learns to reuse bandages by boiling them in water heated over fires. They stretch morphine by giving wounded men half doses, just enough to take the edge off pain, but not enough for true relief. They perform surgery with limited anesthesia, sometimes none at all. The screams from the hospital basement become so common that soldiers in nearby foxholes stop reacting. This is what the arithmetic of death sounds like when you're subtracting faster than you can add. By December 23rd, the supply situation has reached critical mass in specific measurable ways. Artillery ammunition, enough for 48 hours at current consumption rates. Medical morphine, effectively exhausted, rationed to the most severe cases only. Food, 3 days of reduced rations remaining. Fuel for vehicles, sufficient for 5 days, but only if vehicles run minimally. Small arms ammunition, adequate for now, but with no resupply possible. Adequacy won't last if fighting intensifies. Every staff officer in McAuliffe's command post understands the timeline. Somewhere between December 26th and 28th, the defenders will reach a point where they cannot effectively fight even if they want to. Artillery will fall silent for lack of shells. Soldiers will be too weak from hunger to mount counterattacks. Wounded will die from treatable injuries because there's no morphine for surgery. The mathematics are brutal and final. The soldiers in foxholes don't need staff officers to explain the arithmetic. They can count their own rifle clips, see the reduced food portions, hear the difference when artillery fires only 10 shells instead of 50. They know they're consuming irreplaceable supplies, and they know what happens when those supplies run out. What's remarkable, what will confuse historians for decades, is that morale doesn't collapse under this knowledge. Men don't surrender or desert or break. They dig deeper into frozen ground. They volunteer for patrols into German-held territory. They carry wounded comrades on their backs for miles because ambulances can't reach them. Some of this is training, the reflexive obedience drilled into them by months of preparation. Some is pride, the refusal to be the first unit to quit. But much of it is simply arithmetic working in reverse. They know they have 2 or 3 days of supplies, so they decide to fight for 2 or 3 days and see what happens. Maybe relief arrives. Maybe the Germans withdraw. Maybe the weather breaks and supplies can be airdropped. The arithmetic says they should lose, but arithmetic doesn't account for human stubbornness, the refusal to accept what mathematics proves. So they count their shells and ration their morphine and eat their half rations, and they wait for December 23rd, when the weather will finally break and they'll discover whether American air power can solve the equation that American logistics cannot. December 21st, 1944, dawn. Major William Desabris stands in a frozen Belgian field outside Noville, 3 miles north of Bastogne, watching his artillery forward observer perform calculations that would normally take a fire direction center 30 minutes. Lieutenant James Murphy has a map, a compass, a slide rule, and a radio. He has no fancy equipment, no fire direction computer, no support staff. What he has is 4 years of mathematics training from West Point, and a desperate need to destroy German tanks that are forming up in the woods 2,000 yards away. Murphy does the math in his head: azimuth to target, distance to target, altitude adjustment, wind correction. He calls the data to the 4 artillery battalions positioned in Bastogne. Then he adds something unusual to his fire mission request. TOT, all battalions, my command. Time on target, every gun firing at once. And Murphy, a 23-year-old lieutenant, is calling the shot. 30 seconds later, 16 105mm shells arrive on target simultaneously. The effect is apocalyptic. German tanks and infantry assembling in the woods simply disintegrate under concentrated fire. No gradual suppression, no ranging shots, no giving the enemy time to scatter and take cover. One moment, there's a German assault formation. The next moment, there's smoke and craters and burning vehicles. Desabris watches through binoculars and sees something he's never seen before. German tanks reversing, withdrawing, giving up an attack before it's even fully developed. The TOT mission broke them psychologically before contact was even made. When Murphy's after-action report reaches McAuliffe's headquarters, artillery officers crowd around, asking questions, demanding details. This isn't standard procedure. This is improvisation under pressure, and it works better than standard procedure ever did. The artillery battalions defending Bastogne have an advantage that won't become fully apparent until later. They're surrounded, and that means they can shoot in any direction without worrying about hitting friendly units. In a normal defensive line, artillery sits behind the infantry and fires forward. If guns need to shoot to the sides or rear, they have to worry about hitting adjacent American units, not in Bastogne. The 105th Field Artillery Battalion, positioned near the center of the perimeter, can traverse its guns 360 degrees and engage targets in any direction with equal speed. When Germans attack from the east, the guns swivel east. When attacks develop from the north, the guns swing north. This tactical flexibility multiplies the effectiveness of every battery. 48 guns defending a normal front can only engage targets in their sector. 48 guns defending Bastogne can engage targets everywhere simultaneously. Lieutenant Colonel Barry Griffith, commanding the 105th Field Artillery Battalion, develops a system that will become legendary in artillery circles: interlocking fire zones. He divides the perimeter into sectors and calculates pre-planned fires for every possible target in each sector. Road junctions, tree lines, villages, ridge lines, anywhere German troops might assemble or advance. Then he coordinates with the other 3 artillery battalions to create overlapping coverage. If Germans attack Sector A, 2 battalions can hit them from different angles. If they attack Sector B, different batteries engage. The system requires extraordinary coordination. Every gun crew memorizing dozens of fire missions. Every forward observer knowing which battalions to call for which targets. But once it's established, Bastogne's artillery can respond to threats in seconds rather than minutes. A forward observer sees German movement, calls a sector code, and 16 shells arrive on target within 30 seconds. No lengthy fire mission requests, no back and forth with fire direction centers, just swift, decisive, devastating fire. The Germans quickly learned to fear American artillery in ways they didn't earlier in the war. Part of this is technology. The Americans are using VT, variable time, proximity fuses, a new invention that's devastating to infantry. Traditional artillery shells explode on contact with the ground, sending shrapnel sideways and up. Soldiers in foxholes or trenches are relatively protected. VT fuses use radar to detonate shells at a preset height above the ground, typically 20 feet. When these shells explode, they shower shrapnel straight down into foxholes and trenches. There's no cover, no safe place to hide. A single VT fuse shell exploding above a German squad can wound every man. German soldiers report in captured interrogations that they'd rather face tank attacks than American proximity-fused artillery. At least, with tanks you can hide or run or fight back. Against artillery that explodes above your head, you can only die. But technology alone doesn't explain the artillery's success. The real miracle is accuracy. Normally, artillery fires area targets. You designate a general location and saturate it with shells, hoping some hit the enemy. Bastogne's artillery is firing point targets, specific locations measured to within 50 meters. This precision comes from survey teams who, in the chaos of establishing the defense, took time to position every gun with extraordinary care. They used transits and theodolites to measure each gun's exact location within 2 meters. They calculated exact azimuths to key terrain features. They created firing tables that accounted for altitude, temperature, and even the rotation of the Earth. These survey teams worked through the nights of December 19th and 20th, often under German artillery fire, because they understood that accuracy would matter more than volume once the ammunition ran low. The ammunition conservation tactics become increasingly sophisticated as supplies dwindle. Forward observers learn to call for mixed effects, some shells with VT fuses to kill infantry, some with delayed fuses to destroy vehicles, all aimed at the same target in the same fire mission. This maximizes the effect of every shell. Fire direction officers calculate the minimum number of shells needed to achieve the desired effect. Then cut that number by 20% and see if it still works. Usually it does, because accurate fire with 16 shells accomplishes more than inaccurate fire with 50. The artillery battalions develop informal competitions to see which battery can achieve the best results with the fewest rounds. These aren't games. Men's lives depend on making every shell count, but the competitive spirit drives innovation. Battery commanders experiment with different firing patterns, different shell mixes, different timing sequences. The lessons they learn in Bastogne will revolutionize American artillery doctrine. December 23rd brings the ultimate test of the artillery system. German forces launch coordinated attacks on 3 sides of the perimeter, east, north, and west, attempting to overwhelm American defenses through simultaneous pressure. The artillery battalions respond with a precision ballet of fire. Griffith's 105th Battalion engages targets to the east. The 321st Glider Field Artillery Battalion covers the north. The 377th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion handles the west, and the 907th Glider Field Artillery Battalion provides reinforcing fires wherever needed. The 4 battalions fire over 600 rounds in 3 hours, a rate that would be suicidal given the ammunition shortage, except that every shell is making German attacks falter and break. Forward observers report German infantry melting away under artillery fire. Tank attacks that should press forward to contact instead stop at 1,000 yards, unwilling to advance into the kill zones that American fire has created. The most dramatic moment comes in mid-afternoon, when Lieutenant Murphy, still observing from Noville, calls fire on his own position. German infantry has infiltrated to within 50 yards of his foxhole. He can't withdraw. Germans are between him and American lines. So, he does the only thing possible. He calls down artillery on himself and his 3-man team, knowing the VT fuse shells will kill Germans in the open while he and his men crouch in their foxhole. The fire mission is executed with nightmarish precision. 16 shells explode 20 feet above Murphy's position. German soldiers caught in the open are shredded by shrapnel. Murphy and his team survive with ringing ears and shell shock but no serious wounds. When the smoke clears, German bodies litter the ground and the attack has been broken. Murphy's report to headquarters is laconic. Fire mission successful, recommend repeating as needed. McAuliffe reads the report and orders Murphy recommended for a Silver Star, but more importantly, he orders the tactic disseminated to all forward observers. If you're about to be overrun, call artillery on yourself. Trust the math, trust the accuracy, trust that American precision will kill Germans while sparing Americans. It's a terrifying calculation, but the artillery has earned that trust. By evening, the Germans have withdrawn on all three sides, leaving behind burning vehicles and dead soldiers. The perimeter holds. And crucially, ammunition consumption was 600 rounds, heavy but not catastrophic. The artillery officers calculate they have enough shells for 2 more days of fighting at this intensity, perhaps 3 if they're even more conservative. It's not victory, they're still surrounded, still cut off, still facing imminent supply collapse, but it's survival. The artillery hasn't just defended the perimeter, it's bought time. Time for weather to break, time for air resupply, time for relief columns to fight their way north. The Germans came with overwhelming numbers, and the numbers should have won. Instead, American artillery turned mathematics into miracles, making 48 guns perform like 200, making limited ammunition feel inexhaustible. The siege isn't over, the crisis isn't resolved, but the defenders now know they have a weapon that German numbers can't overcome: precision, coordination, and artillery crews who refuse to waste a single shell because they know every shell might be the one that saves a life. The miracle isn't that the guns keep firing. The miracle is that every shot counts. December 22nd, 1944, 11:30 in the morning. 4 German officers appear on the road leading into Bastogne from the south, walking slowly beneath a white flag improvised from a bed sheet. At the American outpost near Remeuil-Fossé, a small village on the perimeter, Private Leo Palma sees them first and doesn't believe his eyes. Germans don't walk toward American lines. They attack, they retreat, they die, but they don't stroll up in broad daylight carrying surrender flags. Palma shouts for his squad leader, who shouts for the platoon sergeant, who finally calls company headquarters to report something nobody's trained for. The Germans want to talk. Within minutes, the 4 officers, a major, 2 lieutenants, and an enlisted man carrying the flag, are blindfolded and led through American positions toward command headquarters. They're polite, professional, speaking excellent English. One of them carries a leather briefcase. Inside is a document that will become the most famous ultimatum in American military history. The German delegation is brought to the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment's command post, where Colonel Joseph Harper, the regimental commander, receives them with bemusement bordering on comedy. Harper is a hard man, a professional soldier who landed at Normandy and fought through France and Market Garden without surrendering an inch of ground. The idea that Germans think he might surrender now, when his regiment hasn't even been seriously attacked yet, strikes him as absurd. The German major, whose name is Henke according to the briefcase documents, stands stiffly and announces he has a message from the commanding general of German forces surrounding Bastogne. He requests the message be delivered to the American commander immediately. Harper tells him to hand it over. The major insists it must be delivered through proper channels, commander to commander. Harper tells him this is America, not Prussia, and if he's got something to say it. The major opens the briefcase and produces 2 typed documents, one in German, one in English. The English version is grammatically perfect and psychologically revealing. To the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne, it begins, establishing immediately that the Germans believe they're negotiating from strength. The message continues, the fortune of war is changing. This time, strong German armored units have encircled the USA forces in and near Bastogne. This is factually accurate, but tactically meaningless. Being surrounded doesn't mean defeat unless you can't fight. The next section reveals the German calculation. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. The word honorable is doing heavy work here. The Germans are offering Americans a face-saving way to quit without calling it quitting. The ultimatum continues with specific conditions. All American forces must surrender by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, roughly 2 hours from now. Any American who surrenders will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Medical personnel will be allowed to continue caring for wounded. But then comes the threat that reveals German desperation. All the serious civilian losses caused by our artillery fire would not correspond with the well-known American humanity. Harper reads this twice, then starts laughing. The Germans are threatening to shell civilians who evacuated Bastogne 3 days ago, civilians who aren't even here anymore, if Americans don't surrender. This isn't a strong negotiating position. This is the threat of someone who doesn't have good military options. Harper sends a runner to division headquarters with the ultimatum and instructions. General McAuliffe needs to see this immediately. The runner arrives at McAuliffe's command post in Heinz Barracks to find the general asleep in his office, catching 20 minutes of rest after being awake for 48 hours. The staff officer wakes him, hands him the German ultimatum, and waits for a response. McAuliffe reads it once, looks up at the officer, and speaks 2 words that will echo through military history. "Aw, nuts." Then he goes back to sleep, or tries to. The staff officers standing around his desk aren't sure what to do. The Germans want a formal reply. They've given a deadline. Their delegation is waiting at the 327th command post for an answer. Does "aw, nuts" constitute a formal military response to a surrender demand? After some debate, someone suggests they should probably send something in writing. McAuliffe wakes again, irritated at being disturbed twice for the same issue. What did he say? "Nuts," an officer reminds him. "Should we send that?" McAuliffe shrugs. Why not? It's what he thinks. The staff realizes they're actually going to do this, send a one-word response to a German ultimatum, and someone starts typing. The formal reply on official 101st Airborne stationery consists of exactly 4 words. To the German commander, nuts, the American commander. The German delegation, still waiting blindfolded at Colonel Harper's command post, receives the written reply from Harper himself. They're unblindfolded to read it. The major studies the paper for several seconds, confusion evident on his face. "What does this mean?" he asks in his precise English. "Is your reply negative or affirmative?" Harper, enjoying this more than any military operation since D-Day, leans back and considers how to translate American defiance into language a German officer will understand. "It means, go to hell," he says cheerfully. The major stiffens, perhaps realizing that whatever military situation allowed him to walk into American lines under a white flag is about to change dramatically. "If you continue this foolish resistance, your men will die," he says. Harper nods. "We're all going to die, but we'll die fighting, not surrendering." The major tries one more time. "Your position is hopeless. You are surrounded by superior forces." Harper's response enters military legend. "We've been surrounded before. It just makes it easier to shoot at you in all directions." The German delegation is blindfolded again and led back through American lines to their own positions. What they report to General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commander of German forces besieging Bastogne, isn't recorded, but von Luttwitz's response is, "The Americans will be given their wish to die fighting." He orders a major assault prepared for December 24th, Christmas Eve. The surrender ultimatum was partly psychological warfare, convince Americans they're beaten before fighting, but it was also practical. German commanders know their offensive is stalling. They know Bastogne is the reason. They hoped Americans would recognize reality and quit, saving German forces the time and casualties of a major assault. The nuts reply tells them Americans are either too stupid to recognize reality or too stubborn to care. Either way, Bastogne will have to be taken by force. News of the surrender demand and McAuliffe's response spreads through every foxhole in Bastogne within hours. There's no radio broadcast, no formal announcement, just soldiers passing the story from position to position the way armies have always communicated. Word of mouth, growing more embellished with each retelling. By evening, every defender knows that the Germans asked them to surrender, and their general told them to go to hell in the most American way possible. The psychological impact is immeasurable. Soldiers who've been cold, hungry, and terrified for 4 days suddenly feel something approaching confidence. Not because their situation has improved, they're still surrounded, still outnumbered, still facing supply collapse, but because someone in authority validated what they've been feeling. We're not beaten. We're not ready to quit. If the Germans want Bastogne, they can try to take it, and we'll kill them when they try. The other impact is on German morale, though this won't be fully understood until after the war, when interrogations reveal how the surrender ultimatum's rejection affected German soldiers. Many of them expected Americans to surrender. The propaganda they had been fed said Americans were soft, unwilling to fight when things got difficult, dependent on superior equipment and air support. Bastogne's defenders have been cut off from both equipment resupply and air support for 3 days, and they're still fighting effectively. The rejection of surrender, and especially the contemptuous tone of that rejection, tells German soldiers something uncomfortable. The Americans aren't going to break. This isn't France in 1940, when surrounded French units surrendered as soon as Germans appeared in their rear. This is going to be a fight to the finish, and German soldiers begin wondering if they are on the right side of that equation. December 22nd evening. General McAuliffe walks the perimeter, visiting positions, talking to soldiers, letting them see that their commander is alive and confident. He doesn't mention the surrender ultimatum to most of them. They already know. Instead, he talks about the weather forecast. Clear skies expected tomorrow. He talks about relief columns. Patton's Third Army is fighting north, should be here in days. He talks about their mission: hold these roads, deny them to the Germans, and help end this offensive before it goes any further. It's a commander's performance, projecting confidence he might not fully feel, but soldiers take strength from it. They also take strength from knowing that when the Germans offered them an easy out, their general chose the hard path. Nuts isn't just a word, it's a philosophy. It's a refusal to accept defeat even when mathematics and logic say defeat is inevitable. The men in foxholes around Bastogne aren't philosophers. They don't think in grand terms about honor or resistance, but they understand what nuts means in the simple language of soldiers. We're staying. We're fighting. And if you want this town, you're going to have to kill us all because we're not surrendering. Christmas Eve is coming. The Germans are coming. And the defenders of Bastogne, having rejected the easy path, are about to discover just how hard they chose to make their war. December the 23rd, 1944, 4 o'clock in the morning. Private First Class. Kenneth Hessler lies in a shallow scrape of frozen earth on the eastern edge of the Bastogne perimeter, watching the tree line 400 yards away, and trying not to think about how cold he is. Hessler is 19 years old, from Ohio, assigned to Company F of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. The 327th is the red-headed stepchild of the 101st Airborne, not paratroopers who jumped into Normandy, but glider infantry who rode plywood boxes through anti-aircraft fire and crashed into fields. They're good soldiers, but they know the paratroopers look down on them, and now they're holding what everyone quietly acknowledges is the weakest part of the defensive line, a 4-mile stretch of rolling farmland east of Bastogne, where there simply aren't enough men to establish a proper defense. Hessler's squad, 8 men, is responsible for defending 600 yards of front. Military doctrine says a squad defends 50 yards. They're stretched 12 times too thin, and everyone knows it. The landscape makes it worse. West of Bastogne, where the 506th Parachute Infantry holds the line, the terrain is wooded and broken, full of gullies and streams that channel attackers into predictable routes. East of Bastogne, where Hessler's regiment sits, the ground is open farmland, gentle hills offering clear fields of fire, but also clear avenues of approach for German armor, tank country. And the 327th doesn't have many anti-tank weapons. They have bazookas, handheld rocket launchers, effective at 100 yards if you hit the right part of the tank. They have a few 57mm anti-tank guns, obsolete weapons that struggle to penetrate the front armor of German Panthers or Tigers. What they mostly have is hope that American artillery will destroy German tanks before those tanks reach infantry positions. It's a thin hope, made thinner by the knowledge that artillery has to ration ammunition now. 300 yards to Hessler's left, Sergeant Paul Giles occupies another shallow hole with his three-man team. Giles is a veteran, been with the 101st since training at Fort Bragg in 1942. He survived Normandy, survived Market Garden, and he's developed the fatalistic calm of men who've seen too many friends die. His job this morning is to observe and report German movements, to call artillery fire if targets present themselves, and to delay any German advance long enough for reserves to move into position. That last part is what worries him. The reserves consist of headquarters clerks and supply personnel who've been given rifles. If Germans break through here, there's nothing behind his position except 3 miles of empty farmland leading straight to Bastogne. The eastern sector isn't just weak. It's the back door to the entire defense, and that door is barely locked. As dawn breaks, Giles sees what he's been dreading. Movement in the distant tree line. Not a few soldiers, but organized formations. Through his binoculars, he counts infantry and company strength, 120 men or more, assembling at the woodline's edge. Then, behind the infantry, the unmistakable shapes of tanks. He counts them, 5, 10, 15, 20. He keeps counting. 40 tanks in total, probably Panzerpfeffers or Panthers, hard to tell at this distance. They're not attempting concealment. They're forming up in parade ground order, 3 waves of infantry with armor support, preparing for a textbook assault across open ground. Giles does quick mental math. His company, roughly 180 men spread across a mile of front, is about to be hit by a German force 5 times larger with massive armor support. This is what military theorists call unfavorable force ratios. This is what soldiers call "we're fucked." Giles calls artillery fire immediately, reading coordinates from his pre-marked map. The 105th Field Artillery Battalion responds within 30 seconds. This is what their rehearsals and preparation made possible. Shells begin falling on the German assembly area, and Giles watches through binoculars as explosions walk through enemy formations. Men go down, tanks button up, closing hatches, but the German formations don't dissolve. They adjust, reform, and continue preparing. These aren't green troops. These are veterans who know how to operate under artillery fire. At 5:30 a.m., as pre-dawn darkness gives way to gray morning light, the German assault begins. Infantry advance in squad rushes, moving from cover to cover, even in relatively open ground. Tanks follow 200 yards behind, ready to provide fire support. And from unseen German artillery positions, shells begin falling on American defensive positions. The German artillery barrage is the heaviest Hessler has experienced, far heavier than anything during the previous 3 days of fighting. Later counts will estimate 1,000 shells fell on the eastern sector in 20 minutes. The frozen ground amplifies concussions, turning near misses into casualties as men are killed by blast overpressure without visible wounds. Hessler's squad leader, a corporal from Pennsylvania, is killed instantly by a direct hit on his foxhole. The man next to Hessler loses his leg below the knee from shrapnel. Hessler himself is deafened temporarily, ears ringing so loudly he can't hear his own rifle when he starts firing at advancing Germans. The world becomes purely visual. Germans running forward in short bounds, hitting the ground, running again. American rifles firing, Germans falling, more Germans advancing. The mathematics of attrition working in real time, and the math doesn't favor the defenders. At 6 o'clock, German tanks reach optimal firing range and begin engaging American positions with main guns. A 75mm tank gun firing high explosive shells into foxholes produces results better described as molecular dissolution than death. A shell hits near Hessler's position, and when the smoke clears, the 2 men who were in that foxhole simply don't exist anymore. Nothing left but crater and dirt, and small red pieces that might be human or might be anything. Hessler fires his rifle at German infantry until his barrel is too hot to touch, then waits the 30 seconds required for it to cool enough to continue. He's not aiming carefully anymore. He's pointing his rifle toward Germans and pulling the trigger, hoping mathematics work in his favor. Enough bullets in the air, some of them have to hit. By 8 o'clock, the German assault has achieved what commanders feared: breakthrough. German infantry have advanced to within 50 yards of American positions in several locations. In squad-on-squad fighting, 8 Americans can't hold against 40 Germans, not when the Germans have tank support and the Americans are running low on ammunition. Sergeant Giles makes the decision no soldier wants to make. He orders his team to fall back, not retreat, tactical withdrawal to secondary positions. But it amounts to the same thing. The front line is breaking, Germans are advancing, and there's nobody behind Giles except more thin positions and, eventually, Bastogne itself. He reports the situation to battalion headquarters. Eastern sector under heavy pressure, giving ground, need reinforcements immediately. The reinforcements that arrive are exactly what Giles expected and dreaded: a platoon of headquarters personnel, clerks, supply sergeants, truck drivers, led by a lieutenant from battalion staff who's never been in combat before. 40 men with rifles and minimal training sent to stop 40 German tanks and 4,000 German infantry. The lieutenant, to his credit, doesn't pretend this makes sense. He positions his makeshift platoon in a wood line 500 yards behind the original American positions and tells his men to dig in and prepare to fire at anything coming toward them. These clerks and cooks dig frantically, knowing German tanks are minutes away. Some of them are crying while they dig. All of them keep digging. What saves the eastern sector, what keeps the Germans from breaking through to Bastogne, isn't American infantry heroism or brilliant tactics or superior equipment. It's artillery. The 105th Field Artillery Battalion, firing from positions in Bastogne 3 miles behind the fighting, puts steel on target with precision that borders on supernatural. Forward observers like Giles, even while falling back under fire, continue calling fire missions. The artillery fires TOT missions, simultaneous impacts from multiple batteries that turn German advance routes into killing zones. One mission catches a German tank column stopped at a road junction, waiting for infantry to clear a suspected minefield. 16 shells arrive simultaneously, 4 tanks destroyed, 2 damaged. German advance halted for 15 minutes, while crews regain courage to move forward. Another mission hits German infantry assembling in a farmyard. 20 Germans killed instantly, forcing their battalion to reorganize before continuing. The artillery is burning through ammunition at rates that make supply officers weep, but it's working. By 10 o'clock, the German assault stalls. Not because they can't advance, they have the numbers and equipment to push through, but because advancing under constant artillery fire produces unacceptable casualties. German commanders at battalion level start requesting permission to break off the attack, regroup, and try again after suppressing American artillery. Division level denies these requests. Keep attacking. Bastogne must fall. The orders from Hitler himself say take the town at any cost. So German soldiers keep advancing, and American artillery keeps killing them, and the mathematics of attrition continue working through numbers that represent human lives. By noon, the German assault has penetrated half a mile into American positions, but has lost momentum. By afternoon, German units are pulling back, having suffered casualties estimated at 30%, catastrophic losses for an attack that gained insignificant ground. The eastern sector holds, barely. When staff officers total the casualties, the numbers are grim. 180 men in the 327th's engaged companies, 60 killed or seriously wounded, another 40 with minor wounds who remain at their positions. A 33% casualty rate in 6 hours of fighting. These are numbers that normally indicate unit combat ineffectiveness, that usually mean withdrawing units from the line for rest and refitting. But there's nowhere to withdraw to, no rest available, no replacements to bring units back to strength. The survivors, 180 men reduced to 80 combat-effective soldiers, remain in their positions because those are their orders and because giving up those positions means Germans get closer to Bastogne. Private Hessler, still alive despite the mathematics of artillery and gunfire that should have killed him, spends the afternoon staring at the tree line where German tanks disappeared, wondering when they'll come back. He doesn't have to wonder long. Intelligence reports indicate Germans are preparing a massive assault for December 24th, Christmas Eve. Next time, there will be more of them, and there will be fewer Americans to stop them. The weakest link held today. Tomorrow is still coming. December 23rd, 1944, 9 o'clock in the morning. First Lieutenant James Davis stands in a frozen foxhole on the northern perimeter, scanning the sky out of habit more than hope. For 6 days, clouds have blanketed Belgium in a solid gray ceiling from horizon to horizon, sometimes only 200 feet above the ground. The weather has been Hitler's greatest gift. It grounded Allied air forces, eliminated American tactical advantage, made every fight a ground-level slugfest, where German numerical superiority mattered most. Davis has spent 6 days watching the sky and seeing nothing but gray. This morning, as he scans out of habit, he sees something different, blue, a patch of it, small at first, breaking through the cloud layer to the southwest. Then another patch, then entire sections of cloud peeling away like gray curtains being pulled back from the stage. Within 30 minutes, the sky is clear for the first time since December 16th. The reaction throughout the Bastogne perimeter is immediate and electric. Soldiers who've been fighting in misery for 6 days suddenly start pointing at the sky, talking excitedly, slapping each other's backs. The change in mood is almost comical. These men are still surrounded, still outnumbered, still running out of supplies. Nothing about their tactical situation has changed, but the sky is clear, and that means American air power is coming. That means planes can find them. That means supplies can be dropped. That means the siege has a solution that doesn't require Patton's Third Army to fight its way north through German divisions. The psychological shift is as important as the practical implications. For 6 days, the defenders felt isolated and alone, cut off from the rest of the American army. Now they feel connected again. The clear sky is like a phone line being reestablished, and everyone knows the call is coming. At 11:30, the call comes, not by telephone, but by sound. A low, growing rumble from the southwest, building in volume until it's unmistakable. Aircraft engines, hundreds of them. Soldiers abandon their foxholes, despite strict orders to stay under cover, standing in the open to watch history arrive. The first aircraft appear as dots on the horizon, growing rapidly into recognizable shapes. C-47 transport planes, the workhorses of American airborne operations. The same aircraft that dropped paratroopers over Normandy, that towed gliders into Holland, now repurposed for supply delivery. They fly in tight formation at 500 feet altitude, dangerously low, within range of German anti-aircraft guns, but necessary for accurate drops. Davis counts them as they pass overhead, 10, 20, 50, 100, more than he can count because they keep coming. The armada stretches from horizon to horizon. At 11:45, the first parachutes deploy. Colored canopies bloom in the sky, red, blue, yellow, white. Each color coded for different supplies. Red for ammunition, blue for food, yellow for medical supplies, white for miscellaneous equipment. The parachutes drift down slowly, hanging in the cold air like strange flowers growing upside down. Most land within the American perimeter. Some drift into German lines, drawing rifle fire from soldiers who know those supplies were meant for Americans. A few land in no man's land, the shell-cratered space between defensive lines where neither side ventures during daylight. Recovery teams begin moving immediately, racing to gather bundles before German artillery can target the drop zones. The scale of the operation becomes clear as more aircraft arrive. This isn't a token supply drop. This is a full-scale aerial logistics operation, 241 C-47s, making the flight from England through contested airspace to deliver 144 tons of supplies to surrounded Americans. The planning required, assembling aircraft, loading cargo, calculating fuel, timing arrivals, coordinating drop zones, represents a logistics miracle achieved in less than 24 hours. Yesterday, Supreme Headquarters was still debating whether a supply drop was even feasible. Today, it's happening on a scale that makes German commanders watching from their positions realize the siege might not work. Americans don't just have air power, they have air superiority so complete They can fly hundreds of slow, vulnerable transport planes over a battlefield and deliver critical supplies while German fighters stay on the ground, unwilling to challenge the American escort fighters somewhere above the clouds. The supplies themselves transform the tactical situation instantly. Artillery battalions receive 20,000 rounds of 105mm ammunition, enough to replace everything they've fired in 6 days of combat. Medical stations receive morphine, plasma, bandages, surgical supplies. Major Davidson watches bundles arrive and almost cries with relief, knowing he can now perform proper surgery instead of butchery. Infantry units receive ammunition, rations, winter clothing. Quartermasters distribute the supplies with practiced efficiency, sending priority items to frontline units first. By afternoon, soldiers who have been rationing ammunition are firing freely again. Men who have been eating half rations get full meals. Wounded who have been suffering without morphine finally receive pain relief. The arithmetic of death that's been working against the defenders suddenly reverses. They're no longer counting down to zero. They're counting up from resupply. But the arrival of transport planes brings something more important than physical supplies: fighter bombers. At 12:30, as the last transport planes are departing, soldiers hear a different sound, the high-pitched scream of P-47 Thunderbolts diving from altitude. 8 aircraft, then 12, then dozens, all converging on German positions visible from Bastogne. The P-47s are flying close air support missions, the most dangerous flying in warfare because it requires aircraft to descend into range of every German rifle and machine gun. They do it anyway, because American soldiers on the ground need them. The first wave attacks German artillery positions that have been shelling Bastogne for days. 500-pound bombs falling from 3,000 feet create craters visible from the perimeter. Secondary explosions follow, ammunition cooking off, vehicles burning, entire gun batteries destroyed in minutes. Lieutenant Davis, watching from his foxhole, sees something he hasn't seen since the offensive began. German soldiers retreating in the open. A German infantry company, caught by P-47s while moving between positions, simply disintegrates under rocket and cannon fire. The survivors scatter into woods or dive into ditches, abandoning equipment, abandoning wounded, abandoning any pretense of military order. Davis has fought Germans for months and learned to respect them as tough, disciplined soldiers who maintain formation even under fire. But this isn't fire they can fight back against. This is air power, the American advantage that defines modern warfare, and it's devastating to watch even from the receiving end of the benefits. German units that have been attacking aggressively for 6 days suddenly go defensive, digging deeper, moving only at night, trying to make themselves invisible to the aircraft that now hunt them constantly. By mid-afternoon, the air superiority is so complete that forward air controllers begin calling in strikes on targets of opportunity: German observation posts, suspected ammunition dumps, tank assembly areas, anything that might support future attacks on Bastogne. The P-47s respond with enthusiasm, pilots grateful for clear targets after days of being grounded by weather. Some strikes hit with precision that seems impossible. A single 500-pound bomb destroying a German command post in a farmhouse, killing the battalion commander and his staff. Other strikes simply saturate areas where Germans might be hiding, creating destruction that might or might not hit valuable targets, but definitely prevents Germans from using that terrain. The psychological impact on German forces is immediate and severe. Captured prisoners interrogated that evening report widespread demoralization, units refusing orders to attack because American planes will kill us all, commanders losing control of men who've had enough of being bombed. The most remarkable aspect of the air operation isn't the tonnage dropped or the sorties flown. It's the accuracy. Of 144 tons of supplies dropped, 95% land within American lines. 5% drift into German territory or no man's land, an acceptable loss rate. In normal airborne operations, 50% accuracy is considered good. 95% is extraordinary, the result of meticulous planning, experienced pilots, and clear weather that allows visual navigation. Bastogne's defenders receive almost everything that was sent to them, and what they receive changes everything. The siege continues. Germans still surround the town, still outnumber the defenders, still have orders to capture Bastogne at any cost. But the cost has just increased dramatically. Americans who were running out of ammunition now have plenty. Americans who were starving now have food. Americans who couldn't effectively fight because of wounds or exhaustion now have medical care and rest. As evening settles over Bastogne, soldiers in foxholes count their new ammunition, eat their first full meal in days, and watch aircraft still circling overhead like protective angels. Private Hessler, in the eastern sector that nearly broke this morning, receives 12 boxes of M1 rifle ammunition, 96 rounds, more than he's fired in the past week. He stacks the boxes neatly in his foxhole, checking each clip to ensure the rounds are clean and properly seated. Then he looks at the tree line where German tanks withdrew this morning and thinks different thoughts than he thought this morning. This morning, he was counting down ammunition, counting down food, counting down hope. Tonight, he's counting up, counting aircraft overhead, counting supply bundles delivered, counting the odds of survival that just improved dramatically. The sky opened today, and through that opening came not just supplies, but something less tangible and more important. The knowledge that America hasn't forgotten them. They're not alone. They're not abandoned. And they're not surrendering. The siege isn't over, but the defenders now know it's survivable. The Germans are learning it's winnable, and that difference between survival and victory, between besieged and unbreakable, will define everything that happens next. December the 24th, 1944, 5 o'clock in the evening. Sergeant Paul Giles crouches in his foxhole on the eastern perimeter, watching darkness fall and listening to a sound that's been building for the past hour. German artillery. Not the sporadic fire of the previous days, but systematic heavy bombardment. Every few seconds, another salvo screams overhead, shells impacting throughout the American defensive positions. Giles has fought through the artillery in Normandy, through the mortars in Holland, but this is different. This is preparatory fire, the kind armies use before major assaults. Someone in the German command structure has decided Christmas Eve is the night to break the American defense, and they're beginning with artillery designed to destroy positions, kill defenders, and create chaos before infantry and tanks even begin their advance. Giles checks his watch, 5:15 p.m. He estimates 30 minutes of prep fire, which means the assault will come around 6 o'clock in full darkness. Fighting at night favors the attackers, confusion, difficulty identifying targets, friendly fire risks. The Germans have chosen their moment well. The bombardment intensifies. 3,000 shells in 90 minutes. Counts compiled later will establish this as the heaviest German artillery fire faced by the 101st in the entire war. The shells arrive in waves, each wave targeting different sectors of the perimeter. High explosive rounds crater the ground, sending frozen earth geysering upward in black fountains. Airburst rounds explode above foxholes, showering shrapnel downward on soldiers who have no overhead cover. White phosphorus rounds create fires that burn through winter clothing and flesh with equal enthusiasm. And between the explosions, German loudspeakers broadcast Christmas carols in English. Silent Night, O Come All Ye Faithful. Psychological warfare meant to remind Americans they're spending Christmas Eve being shelled while their families are safe at home. Some soldiers find the carols comforting, others find them infuriating. Most just keep their heads down and wait for the artillery to stop, knowing when it stops, the real fighting begins. At 6:45 p.m., the artillery lifts. The sudden silence is almost as jarring as the noise, ears ringing, everything muffled, but recognizably quiet. Then comes the sound every defender has been dreading: tank engines. Diesel growls from multiple directions, north, east, south. The Germans are attacking on 3 sides simultaneously, attempting to overwhelm American defenses through sheer scale. This isn't a probe. This isn't reconnaissance in force. This is everything the Germans have, thrown at Bastogne in one massive effort to break the siege before Patton's relief column arrives. Intelligence estimates place German strength at 18 tanks and 4,000 infantry committed to this assault. The defenders, depleted by 6 days of fighting, amount to perhaps 14,000 combat-effective soldiers spread across a 16-mile perimeter. Basic mathematics say the Germans should achieve breakthrough at any point they mass forces. The attack develops first in the northern sector, near the village of Champs, where Team des Abris has been holding against increasing pressure for days. German Panther tanks advance in darkness, their 75mm guns firing at suspected American positions. Behind the tanks come infantry in company strength, moving quickly through snow-covered fields. The Americans respond with everything available, bazookas fired at close range, hoping to hit tank treads or engine compartments. 57mm anti-tank guns that bounce shells off Panther frontal armor, but might penetrate sides or rear. And most critically, artillery. Lieutenant Colonel Barry Griffith's 105th Field Artillery Battalion has pre-planned fires for exactly this scenario. Germans attacking Champs from specific approach routes. The artillery responds within seconds, shells landing among German infantry with terrible precision. But artillery can't stop determined tanks, and these tanks are determined. By 7:30 p.m., German armor has penetrated the American line near Champs, breaking through weak points between defensive positions. Panther tanks reach 100 yards from American foxholes before tank destroyers can engage them effectively. The fighting devolves into close-quarters chaos, the kind of combat where tanks are vulnerable to brave men with explosives, where infantry on both sides are shooting at muzzle flashes because it's too dark to see actual soldiers. Private Kenneth Hesler, repositioned from the eastern sector to reinforce Champs, finds himself firing his rifle at German infantry, illuminated only by burning vehicles. He hits some, misses others, can't tell which because tracer rounds and explosions create a strobe light effect that makes everything surreal and fragmentary. By 8 o'clock, the German assault has achieved what American commanders feared: breakthrough. German infantry are inside the perimeter near Champs, occupying positions that overlook Bastogne itself. If German tanks follow this penetration and exploit it properly, they could be in Bastogne's center within an hour. General McAuliffe, receiving reports in his command post, makes the decision every commander dreads. He commits his last reserves. These aren't fresh troops held back for emergencies. These are engineers, cooks, clerks, drivers, every man in Bastogne who can hold a rifle, organized into improvised counterattack units led by whatever officers and NCOs can be spared from other sectors. Major William des Abris, whose armored team has been fighting at Champs since December 19th, receives orders to retake the lost ground. He has 40 men capable of fighting, 40 against several hundred Germans who've just achieved breakthrough. The American counterattack begins at 9 o'clock and succeeds through sheer desperate aggression. Des Abris' men, knowing they're outnumbered and that failure means Bastogne falls, charge German positions in darkness. They use grenades, rifle fire, bayonets, whatever works. The fighting is savage and brief, hand-to-hand combat in snow-covered fields, Americans and Germans grappling in darkness. Both sides terrified and furious. Artillery supports the counterattack, but cautiously, American and German soldiers are so intermixed that artillery could easily kill friendlies. Tank destroyers fire into buildings occupied by Germans, collapsing stone walls on soldiers inside. By 10 o'clock, the penetration has been sealed. Germans are pushed back to their starting positions or killed where they stood. The American line, fractured for 3 hours, reforms. But the cost is extraordinary. Casualty reports arrive throughout the evening. 180 men killed, wounded, or missing in 6 hours of fighting. 15% of the defending force in committed sectors. These are numbers that would normally mean withdrawing a unit from combat for rest and refitting, but there's nowhere to withdraw to and no one to replace them with. The survivors remain in position, exhausted beyond description, wondering how many more attacks they can survive. Major des Abris himself is among the wounded, struck by German tank fire that leaves him badly injured, but alive. His executive officer takes command, writing in his log, "Situation critical, but holding. Estimate 50% combat effectiveness in engaged companies. Await resupply and reinforcement." The resupply came yesterday by air. The reinforcement isn't coming at all. On the eastern sector, where Sergeant Giles has been fighting since December 19th, the German assault develops later, but with equal fury. Tank-supported infantry attacks begin at 8 p.m., hitting positions already weakened by this morning's fighting. The 327th Glider Infantry, defending with fewer than 100 combat-effective soldiers in the engaged sector, holds through artillery support and desperate determination. Giles calls fire missions continuously for 2 hours, directing artillery onto German formations while they're still assembling. The mathematics of TOT fires, time on target, multiple batteries firing simultaneously, break up German attacks before they reach American lines. But it's close. At one point, German infantry advanced to within 50 yards of Giles' position before artillery breaks their momentum. At another point, a German tank reaches the American trench line before being destroyed by a bazooka team that's been waiting in a camouflage position for exactly this moment. By midnight, the German assault on all three sides has stalled. Not defeated, German units still hold advanced positions, still threaten renewed attacks, still have orders to capture Bastogne, but stalled, forward momentum stopped by American resistance that should have collapsed under this pressure, but somehow didn't. The Germans withdraw to reorganize, treat their wounded, and receive new orders from commanders who are increasingly desperate. This was supposed to be the decisive attack, the one that broke American defenses and opened the road network. Instead, it's another expensive failure, another day of casualties that Germany can't afford. German after-action reports compiled later will describe the Christmas Eve attack as exceptionally fierce resistance and unexpectedly effective artillery fire. What they mean is, the Americans won't break. We're throwing everything at them, and they keep holding. Christmas Day, 1 o'clock in the morning. Soldiers throughout the Bastogne perimeter huddle in foxholes, trying to process what just happened. They survived, they held. The perimeter is intact, but the cost is visible everywhere. Burning vehicles, cratered ground, bodies that will have to wait until morning for burial because it's too dangerous to move in darkness. Medics work by flashlight in the aid stations, performing triage on wounded who keep arriving. Major Davidson operates continuously, performing surgery on men with wounds that would be fatal without immediate intervention. He's been awake for 36 hours. He'll be awake for another 12. There's no alternative. Private Hessler sits in his foxhole, cleaning his rifle by feel in darkness, and tries to remember what day it is. Christmas Eve, someone told him. Technically, it's Christmas now, past midnight. His family in Ohio is probably asleep, or maybe opening presents if they stayed up late. They have no idea he's in Belgium, no idea he almost died tonight, no idea the war is supposed to be nearly over, but feels like it's just beginning. He finishes cleaning his rifle, checks his ammunition. 4 clips remaining, 48 rounds. Yesterday he had 96 rounds after the airdrop. He fired 48 rounds tonight, which means he hit the trigger 48 times in 6 hours, which means roughly once every 8 minutes. That seems like too little. The night felt like continuous fire. But the math doesn't lie. 48 rounds fired, and he's still alive. And the perimeter still holds. Christmas Eve in hell. Christmas Day in Bastogne. Same thing. The Germans gave them a Christmas present, the most vicious attack of the siege. The Americans gave the Germans a Christmas present in return. Another defeat. The siege continues. The arithmetic of death continues. And somewhere to the south, Patton's relief column continues fighting north, racing against time and German resistance to reach Bastogne before the defenders run out of luck. Because luck is the only resource the defenders have in abundance now, ammunition, food, medical supplies, all replenished by yesterday's airdrop. But luck, that's finite. That's running low. That's the one supply that can't be dropped by parachute or delivered by trucks. And everyone knows luck doesn't last forever. December 25th, 1944, noon. Field Marshal Walter Model stands in a farmhouse 15 miles east of Bastogne, studying reconnaissance photographs and casualty reports with an expression that reveals nothing to the staff officers watching him carefully. Model is one of Germany's most capable commanders, a specialist in defensive warfare who's earned Hitler's trust by repeatedly stabilizing collapsing front lines. But The Ardennes Offensive isn't defensive warfare. It's the opposite, a massive gamble that depends on speed, and speed has been bleeding away for 9 days. The photographs spread before him show American positions at Bastogne still intact, still manned, still capable of resistance. The casualty reports show German losses around the town, approaching 15,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing. And the most damning evidence sits in a folder marked Fuel Status. The lead panzer divisions, those spearhead units that were supposed to reach Antwerp by now, are reporting critically low fuel levels and requesting immediate resupply. Resupply that cannot arrive because the supply convoys cannot get through, because Bastogne blocks the only roads capable of handling heavy traffic. The 2nd Panzer Division's situation report reads like a mathematical proof of failure. The division advanced 60 miles west of Bastogne in the first 5 days of the offensive, reaching the town of Celle within 4 miles of the Meuse River, halfway to the ultimate objective. Then they stopped, not because Americans blocked them, not because they encountered strong resistance. They stopped because their tanks ran out of fuel. Panzers that were supposed to be racing to Antwerp now sit immobile in Belgian villages, buttoned up against American air attacks, waiting for fuel trucks that keep getting delayed. The fuel exists. German supply dumps in the rear areas have adequate stocks. But moving fuel from dumps to forward positions requires trucks, and trucks require roads, and the good roads run through Bastogne. The supply convoys are using secondary roads, muddy forest tracks that turn into quagmires when hundreds of heavy vehicles try to navigate them. What should be a 4-hour drive is taking 16 hours, sometimes 20. Sometimes vehicles simply bog down and have to be abandoned. Model receives similar reports from other divisions. The Panzer Lehr Division, originally assigned to bypass Bastogne and continue west, has been pulled back to invest the town. It spent 3 days trying to advance, then 3 days fighting around Bastogne, and is now at 60% strength with inadequate fuel to continue operations. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division has been attacking Bastogne since December 21st and has suffered 40% casualties. Catastrophic losses for gains measured in hundreds of yards. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, brought in as reinforcement, reports its soldiers are exhausted, its equipment depleted, and its officers questioning whether continued attacks on Bastogne serve any strategic purpose. Every division commander is asking the same question. Model himself is asking, how much more German strength should be consumed trying to capture one Belgian town? The timeline Model examines reveals the offensive's failure with brutal clarity. Hitler's plan called for German forces to reach the Meuse River by December 18th, 2 days after the offensive began. It's now December 25th, 7 days late, and the Meuse is still 4 miles away, with American forces now rushing reinforcements to the river crossings. The plan called for Antwerp to fall by December 23rd. Antwerp isn't even threatened. It's 80 miles from the closest German unit, and every day that passes brings more British and American troops into defensive positions around the port. Most damningly, the plan assumed fuel captured from American dumps would sustain the advance. Some fuel was captured. Abandoned American supply points yielded thousands of gallons, but not nearly enough. The Americans, retreating rapidly in the first days, managed to destroy most fuel stocks before Germans could secure them. The offensive is running on fumes, literally and figuratively. The operational math is simple and damning. German panzer divisions in offensive operations consume roughly 10,000 gallons of fuel per day per division. Model has 5 panzer divisions committed to this offensive. That's 50,000 gallons daily consumption. The supply convoys, struggling through bad roads and American air interdiction, are delivering perhaps 20,000 gallons daily. The deficit, 30,000 gallons per day, is being made up by drawing down divisional reserves, the fuel tanks carried on the panzers themselves. Those reserves are nearly exhausted. Within 3 days, possibly 2, German armor will be completely immobile, regardless of American resistance. The offensive will end not with dramatic battles, but with German tanks sitting empty in Belgian fields, crews having walked home. Model drafts a message to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overall commander of German forces in the West, requesting permission to withdraw forces from Bastogne and redirect them to defensive positions. The offensive has failed, Model's message states with characteristic bluntness. Continuing to attack Bastogne, Wace's forces needed to establish defensive lines and prevent American counteroffensives. The message is militarily sound, tactically obvious, and politically impossible. Hitler has personally ordered Bastogne taken at any cost. Hitler has bet Germany's last mobile reserves on this offensive. Hitler does not accept failure, and suggesting withdrawal is suggesting Hitler was wrong. Von Rundstedt receives Model's message and files it away without responding, knowing that forwarding it to Hitler would only result in both their dismissals. Instead, Model receives new orders from Hitler's headquarters. Continue attacking Bastogne. Commit additional forces if necessary. The town must fall to restore German logistics and demonstrate German offensive capability. The orders reveal Hitler's complete disconnection from battlefield reality. Additional forces don't exist. Every division in the West is already committed. German logistics aren't restored by capturing Bastogne. They're broken by the failure to capture it quickly. And German offensive capability isn't demonstrated by battering against American defenses for 9 days while losing 15,000 men. Model reads these orders with the fatalism of professional officers serving political masters. He will continue attacking because those are his orders. His soldiers will continue dying because refusal means execution. And the offensive will continue failing because mathematics don't care about Hitler's wishes. December 26th brings reports that transform German strategic calculations from poor to catastrophic. American forces break through German defensive lines south of Bastogne. Patton's Third Army, pushing north with armored divisions, smashes through the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and establishes contact with Bastogne's defenders. The siege is broken, not eliminated. German forces still surround Bastogne on 3 sides, but broken. A narrow corridor now connects the defenders to American lines, and through that corridor begins flowing the one thing that can sustain the defense indefinitely: supplies. Ammunition convoys arrive within hours of contact. Food, medical supplies, fuel, reinforcements, everything the airdrop provided is now available in unlimited quantities. The arithmetic that might have defeated the defenders given another week of siege becomes irrelevant. Bastogne isn't going to fall. Bastogne can't fall. The opportunity has passed. German commanders at division level begin receiving reports that fundamentally alter their understanding of the operational situation. American prisoner interrogations reveal the defenders were nearly out of ammunition on December 22nd before the airdrop. They were days from starvation. They were treating wounded without adequate medical supplies. Another 72 hours of siege might have forced surrender through supply exhaustion, but 72 hours didn't happen. The weather broke, supplies arrived, and now the corridor provides unlimited resupply. The conclusion is mathematically obvious. The siege should have worked, would have worked, would work in any future scenario. But in this specific historical moment, with this specific weather break and this specific relief operation, it failed. The Germans came within 3 days of winning through logistics what they couldn't win through combat. 3 days. The margin between German victory and German defeat at Bastogne measures 72 hours. The broader strategic implications are even more devastating. The Ardennes Offensive, conceived as a lightning strike to split Allied armies and capture Antwerp, has consumed 20 days and achieved nothing except massive German casualties and equipment losses. The lead panzer divisions that reached the Meuse River are now being encircled by American counterattacks. Model receives reports that the 2nd Panzer Division, trapped at cells without fuel, is being destroyed by American armor. Nearly 5,000 men, hundreds of vehicles, all lost because they advanced too far without adequate supply. The Panzerlehr Division, pulled back from the advance to attack Bastogne, lost its offensive capability battering against the defenders. 5 German divisions, 45,000 men, spent a week trying to capture a town held by 18,000 Americans, and failed. The forces committed to Bastogne represent roughly 20% of German strength in the Ardennes Offensive. That 20% achieved nothing, except to prevent the other 80% from succeeding. Model studies his maps one final time and understands what histories will later confirm. The Ardennes Offensive failed the moment Bastogne didn't fall on December 20th as planned. Everything after that date was momentum carrying a corpse forward, the illusion of offensive action masking strategic collapse. Hitler's last gamble failed. Germany's last mobile reserves are depleted. The Eastern Front, temporarily stabilized by withdrawing forces for the Ardennes, is about to collapse as the Soviets launch their winter offensive. And the war, which might have been prolonged by success in the Ardennes, will now end within months, all because one Belgian crossroads town refused to surrender when logic and mathematics said it should. Model doesn't write these conclusions in any report. Such honesty would be fatal. But he knows them. Every German general knows them. And knowing them, they continue fighting because surrender isn't an option, and retreat requires Hitler's permission, and Hitler gives no permissions that admit failure. So, the German dilemma remains unresolved. Fight for Bastogne and waste forces needed elsewhere, or abandon Bastogne and admit the offensive has failed. Model chooses the only option available to a German general in December 1944. He continues attacking, continues losing, continues pretending the situation can somehow be salvaged. The dilemma isn't military, it's political and psychological. And those aren't problems artillery can solve. December 19th, 1944, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. General George S. Efitz Patton stands in a church in Verdun, France, looking at a wall map and making a promise that every staff officer in the room believes is impossible. Patton commands the Third Army, roughly 250,000 men currently engaged in offensive operations toward the Saar River in eastern France. His forces are advancing, taking ground, fighting successfully, everything an army commander wants. And now, General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander, is asking him to disengage from that successful offensive, pivot his entire army 90 degrees to the north, and attack into the German penetration in Belgium. Eisenhower asks how soon Patton can move. Patton, without hesitation, says 48 hours. The room goes silent. Moving an army that size, with all its equipment and supplies, requires weeks of planning. Patton is promising to do it in 2 days. The promise is impossible, and Patton knows it's impossible, which is exactly why he makes it. Patton has built his reputation on achieving the impossible, on moving faster than enemy commanders think possible, on attacking when conventional wisdom says to defend. He's also built his reputation on saying outrageous things, some of which he means, some of which are performance art designed to motivate subordinates or intimidate enemies. The promise to relieve Bastogne in 48 hours is both. Patton genuinely believes he can move faster than anyone expects, and he wants Eisenhower to see him as the commander who solves unsolvable problems. Whether he actually believes 48 hours is achievable, or whether he's counting on everyone being so impressed by 72 hours that they'll forgive the exaggeration, that's harder to say. Patton himself might not know. What Patton's staff knows is that moving the Third Army north is a logistics nightmare of extraordinary complexity. They're not just marching soldiers from point A to point B, they're moving 3 corps, 12 divisions with all their tanks, trucks, artillery, ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, and the administrative infrastructure that keeps modern armies functional. They're moving on roads clogged with refugees and retreating American units. They're moving in blizzard conditions, with snow and ice making every mile treacherous. And they're not moving to occupy peaceful territory. They're moving to attack German forces that are themselves advancing, which means American and German units will encounter each other in meeting engagements, the most chaotic form of combat. The staff begins planning immediately, working through the night of December 19th and into December 20th, calculating road networks and march tables and supply requirements. The key unit for relieving Bastogne is the 4th Armored Division, one of Patton's best formations, currently positioned 40 miles south of Bastogne. 4th Armored receives orders on December 22nd. Attack north, break through German lines, reach Bastogne. The division commander, Major General Hugh Gaffey, understands this means fighting through at least 2 German divisions that are themselves trying to advance west. This isn't a movement to contact. This is a head-on collision between two armies moving in opposite directions. Gaffey divides his division into 3 combat commands and orders them to advance on parallel roads, racing north while smashing through any German resistance. The fighting begins immediately and intensely. December the 22nd through December 25th sees some of the most vicious combat of the entire Ardennes campaign. 4th Armored Division advances roughly 1 mile per day, not because the soldiers are slow or cautious, but because every mile is contested by German forces that need to keep the corridor to Bastogne closed. American Sherman tanks encounter German Panthers and Tigers in village streets, in forests on frozen hillsides. Tank versus tank combat at ranges measured in hundreds of yards, where the first shot usually determines survival. 4th, Armored loses dozens of tanks. Later counts will show 142 tanks damaged or destroyed in 4 days of fighting. German losses are comparable or higher, but they're defending shorter supply lines, while Americans are advancing into increasingly tenuous positions. The weather is as much an enemy as German gunfire. Temperatures hover in the teens Fahrenheit. Snow falls continuously, limiting visibility to a few hundred yards. Roads become sheets of ice where tanks slide sideways on turns, where supply trucks jackknife and block traffic for hours. Soldiers sleep in tanks or frozen holes scraped in snow, going days without hot food, without dry clothing, without adequate rest. Trench foot becomes epidemic, soldiers whose feet freeze in wet boots, causing tissue damage that sometimes requires amputation. Medical officers report treating more cases of frostbite than combat wounds in some battalions. This is winter warfare at its most brutal, and 4th Armored Division pushes through it because Patton's orders are absolute. Reach Bastogne. Reach it soon. Reach it regardless of cost. December the 26th, 4:45 in the afternoon. Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding a platoon of Sherman tanks from the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, reaches the southern edge of Bastogne's perimeter near the village of Assenois. His tanks have been fighting continuously for 4 days, averaging 3 hours of sleep per night. Losing vehicles and men to German fire that never seems to stop, Boggess sees American positions ahead. Foxholes, defensive wire, soldiers in winter camouflage who look as exhausted as he feels. He radios division headquarters. Contact with Bastogne established. The response is immediate and emotional, staff officers cheering, Gaffey himself getting on the radio to confirm the report. The siege is broken. The corridor is open. Patton's promise, delivered 4 days late instead of 2, has been kept. The immediate priority is widening the corridor. The initial breakthrough is narrow, a gap perhaps a few hundred yards wide where German fire is suppressed but not eliminated. German forces still hold positions on both sides of the corridor, and they immediately begin attacking to close it. American combat engineers begin clearing roadblocks, removing mines, and improving the single road that connects Bastogne to American lines. The first supply convoy enters Bastogne within 2 hours of contact. Trucks carrying ammunition and medical supplies race north, while artillery provides protective fire on both sides of the road. It's dangerous work. German artillery targets the corridor continuously. Trucks are destroyed, drivers killed. But the supplies get through because the alternative is returning to siege conditions. The relief of Bastogne creates an immediate perception problem that will distort historical memory for decades. In newspapers and newsreels back in the United States, the story becomes simple. Patton's Third Army rescued the heroic defenders of Bastogne. The defenders were surrounded, outnumbered, and desperate. Patton arrived in the nick of time and saved them from destruction. It's a compelling narrative that fits perfectly into American hero mythology. The cavalry arriving at the last moment to save the fort. The problem is that it's not entirely accurate. The defenders weren't on the verge of collapse on December 26th. The airdrop on December 23rd provided enough supplies to sustain them indefinitely. The corridor opened by 4th Armored improves the supply situation and eliminates the psychological burden of being surrounded, but it doesn't transform defeat into victory because defeat wasn't imminent. Patton himself encourages the rescue narrative because it burnishes his reputation, and because arguing about who deserves more credit, the defenders or the relievers, serves no purpose. But veterans of the 101st Airborne Division bridle at the suggestion they needed rescuing. They held their perimeter. They defeated German attacks. They never considered surrender. Being relieved is different from being rescued, and the difference matters to soldiers who sacrificed for 9 days believing they could hold indefinitely. The tension between these narratives, rescued versus relieved, will persist in veteran reunions and historical debates for the rest of their lives. Both sides are partly right. Bastogne's defenders could probably have held longer without relief, but probably isn't certainty, and another week of siege might have produced different outcomes. Patton's relief column definitely broke the siege and eliminated the risk of eventual supply collapse, but they arrived after the most dangerous period had passed. The strategic reality is that both achievements were necessary. Bastogne's defense delayed the German offensive long enough for Allied forces to respond. Patton's relief operation ensured that delay became permanent, that the defenders wouldn't eventually be overwhelmed by attrition or supply exhaustion. Neither achievement alone wins the Battle of the Bulge. Both together create the conditions for eventual Allied victory. But nuance doesn't sell newspapers or inspire movies, so the narrative simplifies. Patton rescued Bastogne. The truth, more complex and more interesting, gets buried under decades of mythology. December 27th brings the reality check both sides need. The fighting isn't over. German forces immediately attack the corridor, attempting to sever it and re-establish the siege. American forces defend the corridor while simultaneously expanding it, pushing German positions farther from the critical supply road. The result is 3 more weeks of intense combat, where casualties continue mounting, where soldiers continue dying, where the relief looks increasingly like just another phase of the same battle. The siege of Bastogne officially ended December 26th. The Battle of Bastogne continued until mid-January. Understanding that distinction between siege ending and battle ending reveals something important about war. The dramatic moments that make headlines are rarely the actual ending. They're just inflection points. The real ending comes later, quietly, after reporters have moved on to other stories and soldiers have fought through another 200 casualties, and generals have written reports that reduce human suffering to operational summaries. Patton kept his promise, more or less, 4 days late. He relieved Bastogne, but relief wasn't rescue, and arrival wasn't victory. It was just the beginning of the next chapter in a battle that still had weeks to run. December 27th, 1944. Dawn. Private Kenneth Hessler stands in his foxhole on the eastern perimeter of Bastogne, watching the sun rise over terrain he's defended for 8 days, and realizes with creeping horror that nothing has changed. Yesterday, December 26th, word spread through every position that Patton's Third Army had broken through, that the siege was over, that relief had arrived. Soldiers cheered, embraced, allowed themselves to believe the worst was over. Hessler believed it too. He spent last night imagining rotation to rear areas, hot food, real sleep, maybe even evacuation to hospitals where wounds could be properly treated. He wakes this morning to the same frozen foxhole, the same empty rations box, and the distinctive sound of German artillery beginning its morning bombardment. The siege is broken. The fighting continues. And nobody told Hessler that those two things aren't contradictory. The corridor connecting Bastogne to American lines is exactly what military textbooks call a tenuous salient, a narrow penetration into enemy territory, vulnerable to being cut off at any moment. German forces still surround Bastogne on 3 sides. They still hold the high ground overlooking the corridor. They still have artillery within range of the supply road, and they have orders to close the corridor and re-establish the siege. December 27th brings German counterattacks designed to do exactly that. American forces defending the corridor, elements of 4th Armored Division, and units from the 101st Airborne redeployed south, fight desperate defensive actions. The corridor holds, but just barely. Supply trucks racing north run a gauntlet of German fire. Some make it through, some burn on the roadside, drivers killed, cargo destroyed. For the soldiers who defended Bastogne during the siege, The relief brings psychological complications nobody anticipated. They expected relief to mean rest, rotation out of line, replacement by fresh units, time to recover from 8 days of continuous combat. Instead, they receive orders to maintain positions and prepare for continued operations. The 101st Airborne Division isn't withdrawn, it's reinforced. Fresh units arrive through the corridor and are fed into the defensive perimeter. But the original defenders remain in place because those positions need to be held, and because experience matters. A soldier who's held a foxhole for 8 days knows that terrain, knows the fields of fire, knows where Germans attack from. Replacing him with a fresh soldier means losing that knowledge. So, Hessler stays in his frozen hole, joined by a replacement from a unit he's never heard of, told to show the new guy the ropes. The new guy is 19, terrified, and expecting that being relieved meant being removed from danger. The casualties after relief are substantial and shocking. From December 27th through January 13th, the 101st Airborne Division suffers an additional 1,200 casualties, killed, wounded, or evacuated with severe frostbite. That's nearly as many casualties as the siege itself produced. The fighting is different than siege combat, less static defense, more mobile operations as Americans begin pushing German forces away from Bastogne. But different doesn't mean less deadly. Soldiers advance through frozen forests where Germans have prepared defensive positions. They assault villages held by determined defenders. They fight through snowstorms that reduce visibility to arm's length. And they die, in numbers that make relief seem like a cruel joke. December 30th brings the largest German attack since Christmas Eve. 6,000 German troops, supported by armor, assault from the north in a final attempt to cut the corridor and re-establish the siege. The attack hits exhausted American positions, held by soldiers who've been in combat for 11 days. Staff officers calculating combat effectiveness estimate units are at 60% capability, 40% degradation from casualties, exhaustion, cold weather injuries, and psychological strain. Yet, these degraded units hold. They hold through artillery support, through tactical flexibility, through sheer stubborn refusal to give ground they have already paid for in blood. The German attack stalls by evening, having gained negligible ground at the cost of roughly 1,000 casualties. The corridor remains open. The temperature becomes a weapon more dangerous than German fire. January 1945 brings the coldest temperatures recorded in Belgium in 50 years. Lows of -15 Fahrenheit, daytime highs barely reaching zero. Soldiers fighting in these conditions face physiological challenges that undermine combat effectiveness, regardless of training or morale. The human body at -15 degrees burns calories simply maintaining core temperature, roughly 4,000 calories per day without any physical activity. Add combat operations, digging, carrying equipment, patrolling, and caloric requirements increase to 5,000 or more. American soldiers are receiving 3,000 calories per day through field rations. The deficit produces predictable results: weight loss, weakness, impaired judgment, decreased immune function. Men get sick constantly. Respiratory infections spread through foxholes. Soldiers develop hypothermia despite wearing every piece of clothing they own. Frostbite becomes epidemic. The standard army boot, designed for temperate climates, provides inadequate insulation in extreme cold. Soldiers whose feet get wet, from snow, from sweat, from crossing streams, cannot dry them. Wet feet at -15 degrees freeze. Tissue damage occurs within hours. By the time soldiers realize they have a problem, the damage is often irreversible. Medical officers treating frostbite cases describe the symptoms with clinical detachment that masks horror: feet swollen to twice normal size, skin blackened with necrosis, toes that break off when touched. Some soldiers lose toes, some lose entire feet. Some develop gangrene that requires leg amputation above the knee. The official count shows 2,500 frostbite casualties in the first 2 weeks of January. But that understates the problem because many soldiers never report symptoms. Fearing evacuation means abandoning their units. The fighting after relief differs from siege combat in tactics, but not intensity. During the siege, Americans defended fixed positions and Germans attacked. After relief, Americans transitioned to offensive operations, pushing German forces away from Bastogne and eliminating the threat to the corridor. This means American soldiers, exhausted, malnourished, suffering from cold weather injuries, have to attack prepared German defenses. Infantry assault across open ground against entrenched machine guns. Tanks advance through minefields, while German anti-tank guns engage from concealed positions. Artillery coordinates complex fire missions to suppress German positions before American infantry can close. It's methodical, bloody, exhausting work. Every village taken costs casualties. Every ridge captured means soldiers killed. January 9th marks a transition point. American forces defending Bastogne finally receive orders to transition from defense to offense, to begin operations aimed at eliminating the German salient rather than merely containing it. The 101st Airborne Division, after 3 weeks of continuous combat, begins advancing east and north, retaking ground lost in the initial German offensive. They advance through villages they withdrew from in December, Noville, Foy, Bizori. They find evidence of German occupation, abandoned equipment, hastily prepared defenses, civilian casualties. They find evidence of their own earlier presence, destroyed American vehicles, graves marked with helmets, foxholes they dug in December and are now reoccupying. The physical landscape triggers memories. This is where we held on December 20th. This is where the German tank broke through on Christmas Eve. The terrain is familiar, the mission is different, and the casualties continue accumulating. By mid-January, staff officers compile casualty figures that reveal the true cost of Bastogne. Total American casualties from December 19th through January 13th. 4,700 men killed, wounded, or missing from units defending Bastogne. That's 26% of the 18,000 who began the defense. More than 1 in 4 defenders became casualties. Some units suffered worse. Companies that held critical sectors reported 50% casualties. Platoons effectively ceased to exist, reduced to squad strength. The casualty rate exceeds rates at Normandy, exceeds rates at Market Garden, exceeds rates in any other operation the 101st fought during World War II. Bastogne was the deadliest battle of their war, and most of the casualties occurred after the relief that newspaper headlines celebrated as the end of the siege. Private Hessler survives. He survives the siege, survives the relief, survives 3 weeks of continued combat until finally, on January 15th, his unit is withdrawn from the line for rest. He's lost 25 pounds. He has frostbite in 3 toes that will require medical treatment. He hasn't slept more than 4 hours at a stretch since December 18th, and he's one of the lucky ones. He's alive, mobile, capable of fighting again after rest. The men he served with include those less lucky, killed in action, wounded and evacuated, missing and presumed captured or dead. When his platoon assembles for the march to rear areas, Hessler counts faces. 40 men in the platoon on December 19th, 23 men in the platoon on January 15th, 17 casualties in 4 weeks, 43%. The numbers are abstract until you know the names, know which foxhole each man occupied, know who died in the artillery barrage on Christmas Eve, and who lost his legs to frostbite and who simply disappeared during a patrol and never came back. The psychological impact of prolonged combat becomes apparent in subtle ways. Hessler notices he can't remember what silence sounds like. His ears are always ringing from artillery, always expecting the next explosion. He flinches at sudden movements. He has trouble sleeping even when given the opportunity. He finds himself crying without understanding why. These aren't official symptoms that get reported or treated. This is 1944, before post-traumatic stress is recognized as a medical condition rather than personal weakness. So, Hessler and thousands like him carry their symptoms silently, privately, wondering if they're going crazy or if this is just what war does to everyone. Decades later, psychiatrists will identify these symptoms as combat stress reaction, a predictable physiological and psychological response to prolonged trauma. In January 1945, there's no name for it and no treatment except rest that never comes and alcohol that only makes things worse. The relief of Bastogne, celebrated in newspapers as a triumphant conclusion, was actually just an intermission in a battle that continued for 3 more weeks. The defenders who held through the siege continued fighting through the relief. The casualties continued accumulating. The suffering continued without pause. And when historians later write that Bastogne was relieved on December 26th, they'll be technically correct and fundamentally misleading. The siege ended. The battle didn't. The mythology simplified. The reality remained complex. And the soldiers who lived through both the siege and the aftermath learned that in war, relief doesn't mean rescue, and survival doesn't mean safety. It just means you get to fight another day and another, until either the war ends or you do. January 15th, 1945, evening. Major Douglas Davidson sits in what remains of his field hospital in Bastogne, writing a medical report that will be filed away in Army archives and forgotten by everyone, except medical historians who study combat trauma. Davidson has been the 101st Airborne Division surgeon for 18 months, treating wounds since Normandy, performing surgeries in conditions that would horrify civilian doctors. But Bastogne was different, and his report attempts to quantify how different. Total casualties treated: 2,100 soldiers from December 19th through January 15th. Of those, 643 died of wounds, a 31% mortality rate. In normal combat operations with proper medical evacuation, mortality rate for wounded who reach a field hospital is 10 to 15%. At Bastogne, it doubled, and Davidson knows exactly why. Insufficient supplies during the siege, inadequate evacuation during the relief, and wounds sustained in extreme cold that compromise tissue viability and increase infection risk. The medical arithmetic reveals Bastogne's true cost in ways that tactical reports cannot. Davidson supplies on December 22nd, before the airdrop, morphine for 200 patients, plasma for 72 hours of operations. Surgical instruments sterilized and ready, but no sterilization capacity for reuse. His casualties at that moment: 350 wounded requiring treatment. Simple subtraction shows 150 men treated without adequate pain relief. The airdrop on December 23rd replenished supplies and saved lives, but the math remains grim. For every life saved by the airdrop, 2 more soldiers were wounded in combat after December 23rd. The supply situation improved. The casualty rate accelerated. Davidson performed surgery continuously from December 19th through January 10th, 23 days with an average of 4 hours sleep per night, operating on men whose injuries ranged from survivable with proper care to hopeless, regardless of intervention. The categories of wounds tell their own story about the nature of combat at Bastogne. Artillery and mortar fragments, 48% of casualties. Small arms fire, 27%. Cold weather injuries, frostbite, hypothermia, immersion foot, 18%. Other causes, accidents, vehicle injuries, illness, 7%. The dominance of artillery casualties reflects the static nature of siege warfare, where soldiers occupy fixed positions that German artillery can target systematically. The cold weather casualties reflect inadequate preparation for winter combat, soldiers equipped for autumn weather facing winter conditions. And the other category includes tragedies that don't fit neat categorization. The soldier who fell off a truck and broke his neck, the cook who suffered a heart attack from exhaustion, the lieutenant who shot himself cleaning his pistol because his hands were too numb to manipulate the safety properly. The ammunition arithmetic provides another measure of the battle's intensity. Total rounds fired by Bastogne's artillery from December 19th through January 15th. 62,100 rounds of 105mm ammunition. That's an average of 2,300 rounds per day, far exceeding doctrinal consumption rates. The breakdown reveals the siege's desperation, December 19th through December 22, conservative fire due to supply concerns. December 23rd through December 26, massive expenditure during German assaults and Christmas Eve fighting. December 27th through January 15th. Sustained high rates as Americans transition from defense to offense. The artillery officers gamble, stretch ammunition through precise fire, then expend freely when resupplied, worked. But working meant calculating how many shells to fire, at what targets to kill sufficient Germans, while conserving enough ammunition to kill Germans tomorrow. It meant making life and death decisions based on trigonometry and ballistics tables. The food situation, never critical but always inadequate, shows the slow grind of caloric deficit on combat effectiveness. Total rations consumed at Bastogne, approximately 540,000 meal equivalents over 28 days. That's 19,000 meals per day, which sounds adequate for 18,000 men until you account for the caloric content. K rations provided 2,100 calories per meal. Soldiers in winter combat required 3,500 to 4,000 calories daily. The deficit, 1,500 to 1,800 calories per day per soldier, compounds over time. After 1 week, soldiers are operating at significant energy deficit. After 2 weeks, they're experiencing measurable strength loss. After 4 weeks, combat effectiveness is degraded by malnutrition, regardless of training or morale. Post-battle medical examinations revealed average weight loss of 18 pounds per soldier. Some individuals lost 30 pounds or more. These aren't trivial numbers. This is systematic starvation under combat conditions. The casualty arithmetic becomes most sobering when broken down by rank and specialty. Officers suffered disproportionate casualties. 38% of lieutenants who began the battle were killed or seriously wounded by the end. Lieutenants lead from the front, expose themselves to enemy fire, and die at higher rates than enlisted men. Sergeants suffered similarly, 42% casualties in some companies. The soldiers most critical to maintaining unit cohesion and combat effectiveness died at rates that should have caused organizational collapse. That collapse didn't occur because junior soldiers stepped up, because corporals became sergeants and privates became corporals, and the Army proved capable of regenerating leadership under fire. But the price was extraordinary. The experienced NCOs who held the defense, men like Sergeant Giles who survived the siege, were exceptional by definition. They were the ones who didn't become statistics. Medical specialties paid their own price. Combat medics, identifiable by red crosses on white backgrounds, suffered casualty rates approaching 50%. The Geneva Convention theoretically protects medical personnel. The reality at Bastogne was that German soldiers sometimes honored that protection, and sometimes didn't, and sometimes couldn't distinguish medics from infantry in the chaos of night combat or artillery barrages. Medics who ran through fire to reach wounded soldiers often became casualties themselves. The replacements who took their places learned quickly that the Red Cross made you visible, and visibility in combat was often fatal. By January, many medics had removed or covered their identifying markers, choosing concealment over protection. It was a pragmatic response to reality. Better to survive without Geneva Convention protection than die with it. The ammunition consumption per casualty provides a final, cold measure of the battle's intensity. American forces fired 62,000 artillery rounds and an estimated 4 million small arms rounds, rifle, machine gun, and pistol ammunition. Total German casualties inflicted, 15 to 20,000 killed, wounded, or captured. That's 3 to 4 artillery rounds per German casualty, 1,000 small arms rounds per casualty. These ratios reflect the nature of modern warfare, where massive expenditure of ammunition produces relatively modest casualty effects. They also reflect American tactical doctrine: suppress enemy positions with overwhelming firepower, then advance with minimized friendly casualties. The doctrine worked. American casualties were 26% of committed forces. German casualties were 40 to 50%. But worked is a clinical term that obscures the reality of human suffering on both sides. The final arithmetic, the calculation that matters most to historians and strategists, is temporal. German offensive timeline. Planned to reach the Meuse River in 2 days. Actually reached it in 12 days. Planned to capture Bastogne in 1 day. Never captured it at all. Every day of delay meant more Allied reinforcements arriving, more German supplies consumed, less German offensive capability remaining. The 9-day siege of Bastogne, from December 19th, encirclement, to December 26th, Relief represented 9 days the Germans couldn't afford to lose. 9 days of American resistance that created the conditions for eventual German defeat. The arithmetic is simple. Time was a resource both sides needed, only one side had it, and the side that didn't have it lost. Private Hessler, withdrawn from combat and writing a letter to his family in Ohio, doesn't think in terms of arithmetic. He thinks in terms of faces: the corporal from Pennsylvania, killed on Christmas Eve, the replacement who lasted 3 hours before taking shrapnel to the chest, the sergeant who froze to death in his foxhole because hypothermia looks like sleep until it's too late. The arithmetic resolves these men into percentages and casualty rates in lessons learned. Hessler resolves them into memories that will wake him up at night for the rest of his life. Both forms of resolution are necessary. The arithmetic tells us what happened at Bastogne in aggregate. The memories tell us what happened to individuals. And the gap between aggregate and individual, between statistics and suffering, reveals why Bastogne matters beyond the tactical and strategic implications. It matters because humans endured it, humans survived it, and humans counted the cost in ways that arithmetic never quite captures. The numbers add up. The losses don't. January 13th, 1945, morning. Lieutenant James Davis receives orders that seem impossible given where he's been for the past month. The 101st Airborne Division will attack, not defend, not hold positions. Attack. Advance east from Bastogne, retake the ground lost in December, eliminate German positions that threaten the corridor. Davis has been defending foxholes for 25 days, thinking defensively, calculating fields of fire and withdrawal routes. Now he has to think offensively, plan how to cross open ground against prepared German positions, figure out how to make his exhausted soldiers assault when all they want is rest. The orders are clear and non-negotiable. The Battle of the Bulge is entering its final phase, and that phase requires American forces to push Germans back to their starting positions. Bastogne, having been the defensive anchor for 3 weeks, now becomes an offensive springboard. The transformation from defense to offense reveals something about human adaptability in war. Soldiers who've been fighting from foxholes develop different mindsets than soldiers advancing across country. Defenders focus on conservation, ammunition, energy, position. Attackers focus on momentum, moving forward despite casualties, maintaining pressure despite exhaustion. Davis's platoon has 23 men, down from 40 at the start of December. These 23 have perfected defensive tactics. They know how to call artillery on German positions. They know how to establish interlocking fields of fire. They know how to make 8 men defend terrain, meant for 30. Now, they have to relearn offense, remember the tactics from training that feel abstract after weeks of being shot at from fixed positions. The mental shift is as challenging as the physical execution. The first objective is the village of Foy, 2 miles northeast of Bastogne. Foy sits on high ground overlooking American positions, providing Germans with observation and fields of fire that make life miserable for defenders. Taking Foy eliminates that advantage and pushes German artillery farther from the critical corridor. The attack begins January 13th at dawn, infantry advancing with tank support through snow-covered fields. The Germans, who've been attacking American positions for 3 weeks, are now defending their own. They've had time to prepare: minefields, defensive wire, machine gun positions in stone buildings. American soldiers advancing on Foy discover what German soldiers attacking Bastogne learned. Defenders with prepared positions and adequate ammunition are very hard to dislodge. The fighting for Foy lasts 6 hours and costs 80 casualties, 30 Americans killed, 50 wounded, to capture a village of maybe 40 buildings. This is offensive warfare arithmetic. Bloodier than defense, because attackers expose themselves while crossing open ground. Davis's platoon loses 3 men in the initial advance, cut down by German machine gun fire from a farmhouse 200 yards from the village edge. They get revenge when American tanks destroy the farmhouse with 75mm fire, but revenge doesn't resurrect the dead. The survivors push into Foy, clearing buildings room by room, throwing grenades into cellars, shooting Germans who resist and accepting surrender from those who don't. By afternoon, Foy is American-controlled. By evening, American soldiers are digging new foxholes in terrain they just captured, preparing to defend against German counterattacks they know are coming. The advance continues daily through mid-January. Villages fall in sequence: Foy, then Baiserie, then Majoret. Each village costs casualties. Each village pushes Germans farther from Bastogne. American forces aren't just recapturing lost ground. They're systematically destroying German combat capability by forcing Germans to defend against an enemy that now has material superiority. The airdrop and the relief corridor mean Americans have unlimited ammunition, food, and replacements. Germans are still operating on strained logistics, still dependent on supply lines that run through territory threatened by American advances. The strategic situation has reversed completely. In December, Germans attacked Americans who were isolated and undersupplied. In January, Americans attacked Germans who are increasingly isolated and undersupplied. The evidence of German logistical collapse becomes visible as Americans advance. Abandoned equipment litters every German withdrawal route: vehicles out of fuel, artillery pieces missing ammunition, supply dumps emptied and hastily destroyed. American intelligence officers examining captured German documents find orders describing fuel shortages, ammunition rationing, inadequate winter clothing for troops. The December offensive consumed German stockpiles at unsustainable rates. The January defense consumes remaining reserves. German units that attacked Bastogne in division strength in December are withdrawing in regiment strength in January. Not because Americans killed everyone, though casualties were severe, but because units dissolved through desertion, surrender, and simple organizational collapse when soldiers realized the offensive had failed. The human cost of reversal appears in prisoner interrogations. German soldiers captured during the offensive's first week were confident, even arrogant, expecting victory, believing American resistance would collapse. German soldiers captured in January are demoralized, exhausted, and surprisingly willing to talk. They describe units without food, positions without ammunition, officers without orders from higher command. They describe watching American aircraft dominate the sky while German fighters never appear. They describe retreating through snow without adequate winter clothing, watching comrades die from frostbite as readily as from American fire. The Wehrmacht that attacked in December was formidable. The Wehrmacht retreating in January is broken, not defeated in any single battle, but ground down by cumulative losses and resource depletion, and the simple arithmetic that Germany can't replace casualties while America can. January 26th marks exactly 1 month since the German offensive began, and American forces reached positions they held on December 16th. Every yard of ground lost in December has been recaptured. The bulge in Allied lines, the German penetration that reached 40 miles deep at its maximum, has been eliminated. The front line is restored. The Battle of the Bulge, from offensive to culmination to reversal, took 40 days and accomplished nothing for Germany except to hasten its defeat. The forces committed to the Ardennes could have been used to defend against Soviet offensives in the east. The equipment lost: 600 tanks, 1,600 aircraft, thousands of trucks cannot be replaced. The trained soldiers killed or captured represented Germany's last mobile reserves. And what did Germany gain? Nothing. Temporary possession of Belgian villages, brief disruption of Allied plans. No strategic objectives achieved, no operational advantage sustained. For American soldiers advancing through recaptured territory, the landscape triggers complex emotions. They pass villages they fled in December, now returning to occupy them in January. They find evidence of German occupation, defensive positions built using American supplies, civilians who survived German control, destroyed American equipment. They also find evidence of their own earlier presence: foxholes dug in December, trenches they abandoned during the initial retreat. Even bodies that were left behind and are now recovered for burial. The physical landscape is familiar, but transformed by 5 weeks of war. Buildings damaged, fields cratered, forests stripped of trees by artillery. This is what battlefield recovery looks like. Not triumphant parades through pristine terrain, but slow advances through devastation, with constant awareness that every mile was bought with lives. Lieutenant Davis, walking through Foy 3 days after capturing it, finds the foxhole he occupied on December 19th during the initial defense. Someone else occupied it later, probably Germans during their brief control. The foxhole is deeper now, better constructed, with overhead cover built from logs and sandbags. Whoever improved this position understood field fortification. Davis sits in the foxhole for a moment, remembering December 19th, remembering the fear and confusion and determination. He remembers German attacks that nearly broke the defense. He remembers Christmas Eve, when survival seemed impossible. He remembers relief, when exhaustion overwhelmed all other emotions. And now, sitting in a foxhole that represents the complete circle of advance, retreat, advance, he understands something about war that training never taught. Territory doesn't matter. Holding this particular foxhole in this particular village meant everything in December and means nothing in January. What mattered was time, buying time for Allied forces to respond, spending time that Germans couldn't afford to lose. The geography was just the board where the real game played out. The reversal is complete by late January. German forces have withdrawn to positions behind their December 16th start line. American forces control all the territory they controlled before the offensive began. The front has stabilized, and both sides, exhausted by 5 weeks of intense combat, begin planning their next operations. For Americans, that means preparing spring offensives to cross the Rhine and advance into Germany. For Germans, that means desperate measures to defend against Soviet armies advancing from the east and Allied armies advancing from the west. The strategic initiative, contested in December, decisively belongs to the Allies in January. The Ardennes Offensive was Germany's last gasp, and it failed. Not because German soldiers fought poorly, they fought with skill and determination. Not because German planning was incompetent, the operational plan was ambitious but feasible. It failed because Bastogne held, because American soldiers in frozen foxholes refused to surrender when logic said they should, because artillery crews made every shell count, because relief columns fought through German resistance to break the siege, because the arithmetic of attrition, working over weeks instead of days, favored the side with more resources. The reversal was inevitable once Bastogne held past December 22nd. Everything after that date was momentum playing out, mathematics resolving, history writing itself through human suffering. The cost was extraordinary. American casualties in the Battle of the Bulge exceeded 80,000 killed, wounded, or captured. German casualties exceeded 100,000. Civilian casualties, less carefully counted, numbered in the thousands. The arithmetic resolved, the reversal completed, and the war continued toward its inevitable conclusion, purchased at a price that arithmetic can measure but never quite explain. February 1945, Paris. A conference room at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force hosts a meeting of senior commanders and intelligence officers convened to assess the Ardennes Offensive's strategic impact. General Eisenhower sits at the head of a long table covered with maps, casualty reports, and captured German documents. The question he's posing to his staff isn't whether the Allies won the Battle of the Bulge. That's obvious. The question is whether winning mattered, whether the German offensive represented a genuine threat to Allied strategy or merely a violent convulsion from a dying regime. The answer matters for planning purposes. If Germany can still mount major offensives, Allied planning must account for that capability. If Germany's offensive capacity is exhausted, planning can shift to exploitation and pursuit. The intelligence officer presenting first offers data that answers Eisenhower's question. Germany lost its last mobile reserves at the Bulge. Everything after this is defensive fighting and inevitable collapse. The strategic assessment begins with German losses. 600 tanks destroyed or abandoned, nearly half of Germany's operational armor in the West. 1,600 aircraft lost, shot down, destroyed on the ground, or crashed due to fuel shortages. The Luftwaffe, which briefly achieved local air superiority during the offensive's first week, will never again contest Allied control of the skies. Personnel losses, conservatively 100,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Germany can replace soldiers through conscription, barely, but can't replace trained tankers, experienced officers, and specialized personnel. The Ardennes Offensive consumed Germany's offensive capability. What remains is sufficient for defense, potentially effective defense in some sectors, but insufficient for strategic offensive action. The temporal dimension matters as much as material losses. The Ardennes Offensive delayed Allied plans to cross the Rhine by approximately 6 weeks. That's 6 weeks Germany gained through tactical action, but those 6 weeks cost Germany resources it needed for strategic defense. The equation is simple. Germany traded 6 weeks of operational delay for exhaustion of forces needed to defend against the main Allied spring offensive and the Soviet winter offensive. Was that a good trade? The intelligence officer's assessment is unambiguous. No. Germany would have been better off withdrawing to defensive positions on the Rhine, conserving forces, and using interior lines to shift divisions between eastern and western fronts. Instead, Hitler gambled everything on achieving a knockout blow in the west, and lost the gamble catastrophically. Bastogne's specific contribution to German defeat receives detailed analysis. The 9-day siege, December 19th. Encirclement to December 26th. Relief delayed German logistics by a week. That 1 week meant lead panzer divisions reached the Meuse River 12 days late instead of 5 days late. The difference between 5 days and 12 days is the difference between achieving strategic surprise and allowing enemy response. When German forces reached Celles on December 24th, American and British reinforcements were already moving into defensive positions at river crossings. The Germans arrived late to encounter prepared defenses instead of empty bridges. That timing difference, directly attributable to Bastogne holding, transformed a potentially war-changing German breakthrough into a tactical penetration with no strategic consequences. The counterfactual analysis, always speculative but strategically useful, examines what happens if Bastogne falls on December 20th, as Germans planned. German supply convoys used the Bastogne road network immediately. Lead panzer divisions received fuel 5 days earlier. They reach the Meuse River with enough fuel to push reconnaissance units across. They encounter American forces that are still repositioning, not yet dug in. The subsequent fighting is different, not necessarily German victory, but at minimum extended contest for Meuse crossings with uncertain outcome. Perhaps Germans establish bridgeheads. Perhaps British forces withdraw to defend Brussels and Antwerp more directly. Perhaps the war in the West lengthens by months. These are possibilities, not certainties, but they illustrate Bastogne's importance. The defense didn't just delay German logistics, it prevented outcomes that might have extended the war. Eisenhower, listening to these assessments, asks the question that historians will debate for decades. Was Bastogne's defense inevitable or contingent? Could the Germans realistically have captured it with different tactics or better execution? The answer requires examining German decisions. Vane-Luttwitz's choice to bypass Bastogne initially, strategically sound given the premium on speed, tactically disastrous given the logistical consequences. Hitler's refusal to authorize withdrawal when the offensive stalled, psychologically understandable given Nazi ideology, strategically inexcusable given military reality. German tactical execution around Bastogne, competent attacks, but insufficient concentration of force to achieve breakthrough. The assessment concludes that German capture of Bastogne was possible, but required German commanders to prioritize the town's strategic value over tactical speed. They didn't, and that failure was decisive. The human dimension receives less analysis in this strategic conference, but matters for understanding Bastogne's significance. 18,000 Americans held a 16-mile perimeter against 45,000 Germans for 9 days. The force ratio, 2.5 to 1 in German favor, should have produced German victory according to military doctrine. That it didn't reflects factors doctrine struggles to quantify: defender advantage in prepared positions, artillery effectiveness, American tactical flexibility, and most importantly, soldiers' refusal to surrender when logic suggested they should. The intelligence officer presenting casualty data notes, almost as a side, that German prisoner interrogations consistently mentioned American artillery and American determination, as reasons attacks failed. The combination of material capability and human will defeated German numerical superiority. The political implications receive attention from Eisenhower's political advisor. The Ardennes Offensive, publicly described as Germany's last gasp, had to be defeated convincingly to maintain Allied unity and civilian morale. A prolonged battle or limited German success would have raised questions about Allied competence, potentially strengthened political factions in Britain and America advocating for negotiated peace. Bastogne's defense, followed by Patton's relief and eventual Allied victory, provided the narrative needed for political cohesion. Germany attacked, America held, the offensive failed. Simple story, politically useful, substantially accurate. The alternative, Bastogne falls, Germans reach the Meuse, fighting continues inconclusively, would have generated political problems with potentially strategic consequences. The Soviet dimension, often overlooked in the Western-focused analysis, matters enormously. The Ardennes Offensive pulled German reserves westward precisely when Stalin was preparing winter offensives in the east. The forces committed to the Ardennes could have defended against Soviet attacks that began January 12th. Instead, Germany faced Soviet attacks with depleted reserves, weakened divisions, and no mobile forces available for counterattacks. The Soviets advanced 200 miles in 6 weeks, reaching the Oder River, 50 miles from Berlin, by early February. This Soviet success was partly enabled by German failures in the Ardennes. Bastogne's contribution to Soviet victories is indirect but real. Every German division stuck at Bastogne was a division unavailable to defend against Soviets. The conference concludes with Eisenhower's summation, later recorded in his memoirs. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last strategic offensive. Bastogne was the hinge on which that offensive failed. The defenders bought time that Germans couldn't afford to lose, and time, more than terrain or casualties or tactical victories, determined the war's outcome in early 1945. Germany needed speed in the Ardennes. Bastogne denied them speed. Everything else followed from that central fact. Eisenhower doesn't engage in hypotheticals about alternative histories. He's a practical commander focused on winning the war at hand. But he notes in his journal that evening, Bastogne mattered, can't say exactly how much. Maybe the difference between ending the war in May 45 versus August 45. Maybe more. The soldiers who held that town bought us months. Bought the Soviets months. Bought Europe the difference between longer war and the war we got. Post-war analysis by German commanders confirms Allied assessments. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, interviewed in 1946, states bluntly, "Bastogne cost us the offensive." General von Manteuffel, who commanded 5th Panzer Army, describes the siege as the rock on which our attack foundered. These aren't excuses or attempts to shift blame. They're professional military assessments from officers who understand that speed was everything, and Bastogne denied them speed. The post-war German narrative emphasizes material factors: American air superiority, supply advantages, numerical strength. These factors mattered, but they matter less if German forces reach operational objectives quickly. Bastogne prevented speed, which gave American advantages time to manifest. The final accounting, compiled by Army historians in 1946, attempts to quantify Bastogne's impact. Direct military contribution, 9 days of delay to German logistics, enabling Allied response. Indirect military contribution, German force consumption around Bastogne that weakened other offensive sectors. Political contribution, dramatic defense that sustained Allied civilian morale. Strategic contribution, prevention of German breakthrough to Meuse River with all its potential consequences. The historians struggle with one element of the accounting. How do you value soldiers' determination? How do you quantify the decision to hold when holding seems impossible? These aren't material factors subject to measurement. They're human factors that defy quantification but determined outcomes. Bastogne's defense succeeded partly through material advantages, artillery, air supply, eventual relief, but it succeeded primarily through human choice, the choice to keep fighting when mathematics suggested futility. That choice changed the history. The historians noted in their report, but can't reduce it to numbers. Some elements of war resist arithmetic, even when arithmetic seems like the appropriate analytical tool. Bastogne was one of them. The numbers explain much. The numbers don't explain everything, and what they don't explain might be what matters most. November 1994. Bastogne, Belgium. Kenneth Hessler, age 69, walks slowly through the Martisson Memorial, a star-shaped monument overlooking the town he defended 50 years earlier. He's here for the 50th anniversary commemoration, one of perhaps 2,000 veterans who made the journey back to Belgium. The Belgian government has organized ceremonies, parades, speeches about American heroism and the liberation of Europe. Hessler appreciates the gesture, but finds himself uncomfortable with the word hero, applied so liberally to everyone who was here. He doesn't feel like a hero. He feels like a survivor, and there's a difference. Heroes make choices. Survivors make do. He survived Bastogne not through courage, though he was certainly afraid, but through luck, through being in the right place when shells landed somewhere else, through random chance that he'll never understand. The memorial itself is impressive, a massive stone structure inscribed with names of American units that fought in the Ardennes. Hessler finds the 101st Airborne Division's name and traces it with his finger. Under that name, somewhere in the thousands of individual soldiers represented, is him. Private First Class Kenneth Hessler, Company F, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. He was 19 years old in December 1944. He weighed 140 pounds when he arrived in Bastogne, 115 pounds when he left. He lost 3 toes to frostbite, suffered hearing loss from artillery that persists 50 years later, and carries memories that make sleep difficult even now. The memorial honors him as a liberator, a hero, a defender of freedom. Hessler looks at the inscription and thinks, "I was a scared kid who did what I was told because the alternative was court-martial or death." The disconnect between memory and legend troubles many veterans at this reunion. The official narrative, repeated in speeches, memorials, and history books, describes Bastogne's defense as an example of American courage, determination, and military excellence. These aren't lies. The defense did require courage. The soldiers did demonstrate determination. American military performance at Bastogne was excellent by any measure. But the narrative simplifies. It removes context, eliminates doubt, transforms complex human experience into straightforward heroism. Veterans listening to speeches about their heroism remember differently. They remember terror, confusion, cold, hunger. They remember moments of cowardice alongside moments of courage. They remember doing what seemed necessary rather than what seemed heroic. The gap between official narrative and personal memory creates cognitive dissonance that veterans resolve in various ways. Some embrace the hero label, finding validation in recognition. Others reject it, uncomfortable with praise for actions they don't remember choosing. Most occupy middle ground, accepting public honors while privately remembering private truths. Sergeant Paul Giles, now age 72, sits in a Bastogne cafe with fellow veterans, discussing what they actually remember versus what they've read in history books. Giles remembers calling artillery fire on German positions, remembers men dying in foxholes, remembers the sound of wounded soldiers screaming for medics. What he doesn't remember is the grand strategy, the operational importance, the historical significance. Those are concepts imposed retroactively by historians with access to documents and perspectives unavailable to soldiers during the battle. Giles fought at Bastogne because those were his orders, defended his sector because abandoning it meant death or capture, and held through 9 days of siege because no one gave him permission to leave. The historical significance, Bastogne as turning point in the Battle of the Bulge, is something he learned reading books years later. During the battle, he knew only his immediate surroundings and immediate mission. The rest was noise and terror. The 50th anniversary commemoration includes an academic conference where historians present papers analyzing Bastogne's strategic importance. They discuss German logistics, American tactical doctrine, the role of weather, the impact of air support. They debate counterfactuals. What if Bastogne had fallen? What if weather had prevented the December 23rd airdrop? What if Patton's relief arrived a week later? These are legitimate historical questions, interesting intellectual exercises. But they're also profoundly disconnected from veteran experience. Veterans didn't think in terms of counterfactuals. They thought in terms of survival. The historians' focus on strategic significance sometimes feels, to veterans, like minimizing human cost. Bastogne mattered because it delayed German logistics is historically accurate and emotionally inadequate. It mattered because humans suffered there, because soldiers died there, because men lost toes and fingers and hearing and sleep and peace of mind there. The strategic significance is real, but it's not the only significance. The question of psychological impact receives attention from researchers studying combat stress. Veterans of Bastogne report higher rates of post-traumatic stress symptoms than veterans of other World War II battles of comparable intensity. The researchers theorize this reflects the siege's characteristics: prolonged exposure to danger, resource scarcity creating additional stress, extreme cold producing physiological strain, and the psychological burden of being surrounded. Combat stress isn't unique to Bastogne, but siege combat's particular stresses produce particular effects. 40% of surveyed Bastogne veterans report nightmares persisting decades after the battle. 35% report hypervigilance responses to unexpected noises. 27% report difficult maintaining relationships due to emotional numbness developed as coping mechanism during the battle. These statistics, compiled in the 1980s and 90s, reveal the battle's ongoing cost. Bastogne didn't end January 15, 1945. It ended gradually over decades as veterans processed trauma and learned to live with memories. The Belgian perspective adds complexity to the narrative. For Belgians, Bastogne is a liberation story. American soldiers freed them from German occupation, fought and died on Belgian soil to restore Belgian freedom. The gratitude is genuine and profound. Belgian civilians maintained American graves for 50 years before official cemeteries were established. Belgian families adopted American graves, placing flowers and tending stones for soldiers they never met. This gratitude comforts some veterans and troubles others. Hessler, walking through Bastogne's streets, sees plaques commemorating American soldiers. He sees museums dedicated to the battle. He sees Belgian children waving American flags at the commemorative parade. The gratitude feels simultaneously deserved and misplaced. He didn't fight to liberate Belgium. He fought because he was ordered to defend Bastogne. The liberation was consequence, not motivation. But Belgian gratitude is real, and refusing it seems churlish. So, veterans accept thanks for liberating a country, while privately remembering they were mostly trying not to die. The commercialization of Bastogne's memory provides another source of tension. By 1994, Bastogne has become a tourist destination. Museums sell replica uniforms and commemorative coins. Tours guide visitors through former defensive positions. Restaurants advertise Battle of the Bulge-themed menus. This commercialization bothers some veterans who feel the battle's suffering is being commodified, transformed into marketable nostalgia. Others are pragmatic. If commercialization keeps the memory alive, sustains Belgian economy, and educates new generations, perhaps it's acceptable. The debate reveals broader questions about how societies remember war. Should memory be preserved in solemn, uncommercial forms? Or is popular engagement, even commercialized engagement, valuable for sustaining memory across generations? Veterans don't agree. The ones who attended the 1994 reunion represent those comfortable with public commemoration. Many others stayed home, uncomfortable with crowds and attention, preferring private memory to public performance. The films and books about Bastogne, particularly the 1949 film Battleground, and later works, shape public memory in ways that sometimes diverge from veteran experience. Battleground portrays the siege with reasonable accuracy given Hollywood constraints: cold, fear, confusion, occasional heroism. But it necessarily simplifies. A 2-hour film cannot capture 9 days of siege, cannot represent the full spectrum of human response to combat stress. The result is a narrative that's essentially accurate but incomplete. Veterans watching these films recognize elements of their experience but also note absences, the constant cold that the film can't really convey, the exhaustion that actors can't convincingly portray, the smell and taste of fear that cinema can't reproduce. The films become how America remembers Bastogne, and veteran memory, more complex, more ambiguous, more honest, becomes marginalized as subjective or individual perspective. The irony is that the subjective individual perspectives are the only direct evidence we have. Everything else is reconstruction. The most profound question raised by the 50th anniversary is whether Bastogne still matters. For veterans, obviously yes. It shaped their lives, determined who survived and who died, created bonds and traumas that persisted decades. For Belgians, yes, it represents liberation and gratitude. For historians, yes, it was genuinely significant militarily and strategically. But for younger generations in 1994, Bastogne is increasingly abstract history. The 19-year-olds attending commemoration ceremonies as guests or students aren't emotionally connected to events 50 years past. They respect the veterans, appreciate the history, but don't feel personally invested the way their grandparents might. This generational gap is natural and inevitable. Memory fades, new priorities emerge. The Cold War ending in 1991 made World War II feel more distant, less relevant to contemporary concerns. Veterans at the 1994 reunion understand they're among the last generations to remember personally. When they die, memory transitions from lived experience to recorded history. Hessler, standing at the Mardassen Memorial, watches younger visitors taking photographs and wonders what they see. Do they see the same memorial he sees? He sees stone and inscriptions that represent 9 days of terror and cold and comrades dying. They see an historical monument representing events they have read about. Neither vision is wrong, but they're incommensurable. Lived experience can't be transmitted to people who didn't live it. The best that can happen is transmission of facts, narratives, and lessons. Hessler hopes the lessons survive even as direct memory fades. War is terrible. Soldiers are human. Heroism is complicated. Victory is expensive. These seem like simple lessons, but Hessler worries they are the first lessons forgotten when war becomes abstraction rather than memory. The 50th anniversary ends with a ceremony at the Henri Chapelle American Cemetery, where 3,400 white marble crosses mark American graves from the Ardennes campaign. Hessler finds the grave of his squad leader, the corporal from Pennsylvania, killed by artillery on Christmas Eve. The grave is well maintained, grass trimmed, stone clean, American flag in place. Hessler stands there for several minutes, not praying exactly, just remembering. The corporal was 22 years old, engaged to a girl back home, talked constantly about the farm he'd run after the war. He didn't run that farm. He's been in this grave for 50 years. Hessler survived, married, raised children, had a career, lived a full life. The randomness of survival bothers him still. Why did he survive and the corporal die? There's no answer except chance. Wrong place at wrong time, right place at right time. Hessler survived, and survival carries obligation. Remember the ones who didn't. Tell the stories when people ask. Accept that memory fades, but facts remain. As veterans depart Bastogne, returning to America or other homes, they carry with them the gap between legend and truth. The legend. Heroic Americans defended Bastogne against overwhelming odds, refused surrender, held until relief arrived. The truth. Scared soldiers did what they were told, survived through luck as much as skill, and accomplished something historically significant without understanding its significance while they did it. Both statements are accurate. Both matter. The legend provides narrative coherence, makes the suffering meaningful, justifies the sacrifice. The truth provides human context, acknowledges fear and failure alongside courage and success, respects the complexity of lived experience. Hessler understands he'll never resolve this tension. He'll be remembered as a hero regardless of how he remembers himself. Perhaps that's okay. Perhaps the gap between how we remember ourselves and how others remember us is just another cost of war, another thing soldiers carry home, along with physical wounds and psychological scars. The arithmetic of Bastogne resolved decades ago. Germans lost, Americans won, the war continued toward its end. The meaning of Bastogne resolves differently for each person who engages with it. For historians, it's a turning point. For Belgians, it's liberation. For veterans, it's personal memory that resists neat categorization. All these meanings coexist. All are valid. And the tension between them, the gap between legend and truth, between collective memory and individual experience, is itself part of Bastogne's legacy. The battle that shouldn't have been won, but was. The soldiers who shouldn't have survived, but did. The memory that can't be fully preserved, but must be. 50 years later, Bastogne remains what it was in December 1944. A place where humans confronted the worst of war and somehow endured. The details fade, the story persists, and winter snow continues falling on Belgian fields where young men once fought and died, for reasons they understood imperfectly but honored completely.